sharing. We'll then go to our scholars panel. We have a series of issues we want to work through with our scholars panel, and that will be a chance. We'll ask general questions. They'll be providing their input, chance for us all to ask our questions as well. And we will be finishing by 5 o'clock today, simply because I have some honey-do list to do before the Sabbath arrives. I need to be out of here by 5:05. All right, are we going live, gentlemen, back there? All right, so once again, we'd like to welcome you back. For those of us joining us online, we're delighted you can join with us. We thank God for the blessings that we've received so far through this Daniel 11 conference. This is the final leg for today, and tomorrow, of course, we have a more general discussion. Elder Bohr is preaching in our first service. Elder Christian Martin is preaching in our second service. And we'll be having some roundtable discussions with evangelists like Elder Rosenberg and Elder Bohr about the role and significance of prophecy in one's personal spiritual life, in evangelism, and also for the Advent movement, the significance of the Advent movement. So we look forward to joining with you again tomorrow from 8:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on this website, villagesda.org. I invite you to bow your heads with me, and we'll invite God's blessing upon our speaker, Elder Bohr. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you again for the opportunity and the freedom we enjoy here to dialogue, to study, to pray together, and to ask you for answers. And Lord, we thank you for the powerful presentations we've heard so far today and yesterday and on Wednesday. And now, Lord, I pray you anoint your servant, Elder Stephen Bohr, as he speaks with us, Lord. I pray that what he shares will be as inspired as the text we are looking at. Thank you, Father, for opening our hearts and our minds. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
What I want to share with you is just a short presentation on Ellen White's concept of the 7 plagues. And basically, I'm just going to follow my notes as I did in the first presentation. This is shorter, significantly shorter. Ellen White had much to say in great controversy about Daniel and Revelation. However, there are some portions of these books that she never quoted, such as the supernatural darkness of the 5th plague, and the drying up of the Euphrates, the battle of Armageddon, and the kings from the east of the 6th. She never quoted the verses. Is it just possible that she had much to say about these verses, although she never quoted them? Let's consider the last 3 plagues of Revelation 16 as an example of how to find Ellen White's commentary on verses that she never quoted. Now, I need to make a clarification. That is that when it comes to the 6th plague, Ellen White does quote verses 13 to 15, but those verses go back to probationary time. Verse 12 and verse 16 take us to the time of the 6th plague. So I want to make that clear. Strangely enough, however, in the next 7 pages, so she quotes phrases from the first 4 plagues on page 628, but in the next 7 pages, she did not follow up with the last 3. Yes?
What page are you on?
It's on the screen. Oh, no.
Yeah, I'm following
Actually, I rearranged the order. Ellen White and the last 3 plagues. Okay. You got it?
Yeah, we've got it. Yeah, thank you.
No, that's in the wrong place. You got to search for in yellow. I added some things, so I thought that we had on the screen. Let's see. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. All right. In Great Controversy 628, there at the bottom of the screen, Ellen White used less than 1 page to describe the first 4 plagues, quoting phrases from all 4. Strangely enough, however, in the next 7 pages, she did not follow up with the last 3. In fact, after page 628, she never quoted any verses from the 5th or 6th plagues in the rest of the book. This has led some to wonder whether Ellen White had any light on the supernatural darkness of the 5th plague, and the drying up of the Euphrates, the battle of Armageddon, and the kings that come from the east in the sixth. It is important to note, however, that Ellen White did quote verses that describe the seventh plague in Great Controversy 636 and 637. Thus, she quoted from the first four plagues on page 628 and the seventh plague on pages 636 and 637, but quoted no verses on the fifth or sixth in between. Thus, there appears to be a gap between the fourth plague and the seventh in her writings. Summarizing, page 628, she quotes phrases from the first four plagues. Page 629 to 635, no quotations on plagues 5 and 6. And then 636 and 37, she quotes phrases from the seventh plague. On the surface, it would appear that Ellen White had nothing to say in Great Controversy about the fifth and sixth plagues, because she does not quote any verses. However, as we shall see, appearances can be deceiving. If Ellen White did offer commentary on the fifth and sixth plagues, where would we expect to find it? Where would we look for her remarks on the plague of darkness, the drying up of the Euphrates, the battle of Armageddon, and the kings that come from the east? The answer to this question is obvious. If she quotes verses from the first four plagues in Great Controversy 628, and the seventh plague in Great Controversy 636 and 37, we would expect her commentary on the fifth and sixth somewhere in between. The key to understand Ellen White's perspective of the fifth and sixth plagues is in Great Controversy 635, where she describes the wicked multitudes of Babylon, the swirling waters of the symbolic Euphrates upon which the harlot sits, preparing to execute the death decree. As the flooding waters are about to slay God's people, the darkness of the fifth plague falls upon the earth, upon Babylon. Here is how Ellen White described the events leading up to the fifth plague of darkness. So the first four plagues are what I call jeopardy plagues, because God's people are in danger. The last three plagues are deliverance plagues, because from the point of the fifth plague to the seventh, God's people are not in danger anymore, because the wicked are going to turn on the harlot. So let's continue. Here she's going to describe the first four plagues have passed, and now she's going to describe the plague of darkness, although she doesn't quote the verses from Revelation. With shouts of triumph, jeering, and imprecation, throngs of evil men, this is the symbolic Euphrates, are about to rush. What is it that rushes? Waters. Are about to rush upon their prey, when lo, a dense blackness deeper than the darkness of the night falls upon the earth. That's the plague of darkness. Doesn't quote verses, but it's the darkness. It should not surprise us that the rushing waters of the sea in Scripture symbolize multitudes, nations, and peoples that are inimical to God's people and which God will rebuke. So you have Isaiah 17, 12, and 13. We usually use Revelation 17, 15, but I think Isaiah is even more powerful. Woe to the multitude of many people who make a noise like the roar of the seas, and the rushing of nations that make a rushing like the rushing of mighty waters. The nations will rush like the rushing. I think that rushing has something to do with waters. The rushing of many waters, but God will rebuke them, and they will flee far away and be chased like the chaff of the mountains before the wind, like a rolling thing before the whirlwind. So the darkness of the fifth plague arrests the multitudes. And the harlot sits upon what? Multitudes, nations, tongues, and peoples. So the darkness of the sixth plague arrests the multitudes, that is, dries up the waters of the symbolic Euphrates upon which the harlot sits. This is how Ellen White describes it. After the darkness, she says, the angry multitudes, that's the waters, are suddenly what? Arrested. That's the drying up of the waters. Their mocking cries die away. The objects of their murderous rage are forgotten. So the fifth plague, no danger anymore for God's people. In the scenario that Ellen White portrays, after the darkness of the fifth plague and the drying up of the waters of the sixth, now here comes the key point, the kings, Christ and his angels, come from the east to to rescue the persecuted remnant. That's plague number 7, by the way. Ellen White writes, these are the kings that come from the east. It says there in Great Controversy 6:40 and 41, soon there appears in the east a small cloud about half the size of a man's hand. Jesus rides forth as a mighty conqueror, faithful and true, in righteousness he doth judge and make war. And the armies which were in heaven follow him. These are the kings from the east, with anthems of celestial melody. The holy angels, a vast unnumbered throng, attend him on his way. So this is how it works out. The wicked multitudes of Babylon, the symbolic Euphrates upon which the harlot sits, are about to drown God's people. A dense darkness of the 5th plague falls upon the earth. The angry waters of Babylon's symbolic Euphrates suddenly dry up or are arrested when God's voice utters the words, "It is done," symbolically portrayed as the breath or sword from his mouth. And then Jesus and the angels come from the east to gather the remnant. However, there is still a missing piece of the puzzle. In the following chapter, which is the desolation of the earth, Ellen White explains that the supporters of Babylon will not only withdraw their support or dry up on Babylon. After withdrawing their support, they will turn against the religious leaders of Babylon to drown them, so to speak. So the waters are not only going to withdraw their support, they're actually going to turn on the harlot. In the chapter, The Desolation of the Earth, Ellen White returns to the moment when the voice of God delivered his people from the raging waters of Babylon. That's Great Controversy 6:35. We know that she returned to the beginning point of the previous chapter because both begin with the voice of God turning the captivity of his people. In Great Controversy 6:54, the chapter on the desolation of the earth begins when the voice of God turns the captivity of his people, which was also the beginning of the previous chapter. There is a terrible awakening of those who have lost all in the great conflict of life. Then Ellen White expands upon the meaning of the drying up of the waters and how they will vent their rage against the religious leaders of Babylon who have deceived them. And this is how she describes it. The people, once again, the waters, see that they have been deluded. They accuse one another of having led them to destruction, but all unite in heaping their bitterest condemnation upon the ministers. They're going to turn on the harlot and the religious leaders. Unfaithful pastors have prophesied smooth things. You know, it's a very serious thing to be a pastor, to be a preacher. Unfaithful pastors have prophesied smooth things. They have led their hearers to make void the law of God and to persecute those who would keep it holy. Now in their despair, these teachers confess before the world their work of deception. The multitudes, one of the words that is used for the waters in Revelation 17. The multitudes are filled with fury. Not at God's people anymore, folks. The multitudes are filled with fury. We are lost, they cry, and you are the cause of our ruin. And they turn upon the false shepherds. The very ones that once admired them most will pronounce upon them the most dreadful curses. The very hands that once crowned them with laurels will be raised for their destruction. The swords which were to slay God's people are now employed to destroy their enemies. Everywhere there is strife and bloodshed. You know, this is foreshadowed in what happened at the edge of the Red Sea. You remember that the armies of Pharaoh were coming after the Israelites, and they were caught. There was no escape. The Gulf of Aqaba was in front of them, very deep. The Egyptians were behind. They were hemmed in. And it looked like they were going to be destroyed. But then Exodus 14 describes how the pillar that went before them, the pillar of fire, moved over the heads and interposed between them and the Egyptians. And it was darkness on the side of the Egyptians, but light on the side of God's people. And then the waters of the Red Sea are dried up to provide a way for the escape of God's people. And then the Egyptians entered, and the waters that dried up to provide an escape for God's people drowned the Egyptians. So there you have a very interesting typological relationship. So anyway, that's it. By the way, this period of the 5th, 6th, and 7th plagues is the very moment that Daniel chapter 11, verse 45 describes as he shall come to his end with none to help him. The waters will dry up. The daughters will dry up, and the kings of the earth will turn against the harlot, according to what Revelation chapter 17 tells us.
All right, thank you. Can you remain there, Pastor? We
Okay.
have some questions for you.
All right.
All right, so do we have a wandering microphone? Is it somewhere in the building? There's a yellow-topped microphone somewhere. Does somebody see it? Oh, yes, here we are. Okay, thank you, Todd. All right, anybody have any questions, comments you'd like to share with Elder Bohr? Yes, gentleman here with the right beside you there, Todd, guy with the baseball cap on. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for the research, for the many hours. You presented it in 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and it took you many hours to do that work. I have, I don't know if it is a question or a clarification. It seems to me, maybe it's bad perception on my part, it seems to me that you equate 11:45 to the second coming, when the beast, or the king of the north, is going to be destroyed.
Okay, the answer to that is that Daniel 11:45, the last phrase, he will come to his end with none to help him. I do not see that as the second coming of Christ. I see that as the moment when those who supported this system actually turn against the system. They turn against the harlot that has deceived them, and the daughters that have deceived them as well. And then, of course, that prepares the way for the coming of Christ with the angelic hosts,
Okay.
which is mentioned in Revelation 16, the moment of the sixth plague.
I see 11:45 simultaneous with 12:1, when the 10 kings take away the political power, but they don't destroy the king of the north in 11:45. In 2 Thessalonians 2:13, the beast, the king of the north, is going to destroy at the second coming. So the sequence is 11:45, but the papacy is going to be destroyed at the second coming after the voice of God that liberates us.
There's actually no contradiction between one and the other. Before Jesus comes with the armies of heaven, those that supported Babylon are going to take away their support. And when they're slaying one another, you can read this in Great Controversy, at that very moment, then Jesus will be coming on the clouds of heaven to destroy everyone by the brightness of his coming. So in other words, first the withdrawal support, which prepares the way, according to Revelation chapter 16, for the coming of Christ and his host. When Jesus comes, the wicked are not going to be shooting nuclear weapons at Christ. Mm-hmm. You know, like many evangelicals teach, that the final war of Armageddon is that the wicked are going to be shooting at Christ as he's coming on the clouds. No, not at all. When Jesus returns, when Jesus comes back, the wicked are not focused on Jesus. The wicked are focused on destroying the enemies that they had considered friends before. Does that help?
All right, so we have a question of Todd over there, Dr. Perry. Raise your hand, Dr. Perry, so we can see you. Then we'll come to Brother Tim. But a question from online from Laura Esselbach. She says, Elder Bohr, how does correctly looking back to historical events repeating themselves lead you to the conclusion that Sister White is inferring a change of the King of the South player from radical Islamic system to atheism or communist philosophy, especially since atheism is being brought into the Catholic faith by this current Pope, which would seem to contradict your change?
Okay, that's a very good question. I've written several newsletters. We have a newsletter at Secrets Unsealed, and it's a pretty hefty article that I write for each one. Benedict XVI and John Paul II considered communism to be the deadly enemy of the Roman Catholic Church. But Francis I has drawn close to atheism. In fact, there are some conservative Roman Catholics that consider that Francis I is a communist. In fact, they say he's a communist. You know, there's this Spanish program on television, his name is Bailey, and he openly says, he's not an Adventist, obviously, he says the Pope is a communist because what he has tried to do is kind of merge with Catholicism. We usually think that the papacy is going to destroy communism, but really it's the papacy joining communism, because this pope is not really primarily a religious pope. He's a pope that wants to recover political power.
Yeah, and if I may just add to that as well, the papacy is neither right nor left, but it can work with both sides. And Thomas Aquinas discussed at some length the rights of property, private property. And from a Marxist perspective, all the goods and means of production should be held in common. And in Catholic theology, you have divine law, and you have natural law, and you have God's law, and then you have human law, which kind of is the bottom of this hierarchy of laws. And Aquinas argued that private property should only be held or allowed in a Catholic worldview if it is held for the common good. That is, private property held for the benefit of the individual is not legitimately held private property. And so on that basis, the Catholic Church can work with right-wing regimes and also with left-wing regimes. And throughout history, the Catholic Church will baptize somebody else's beliefs and give it a Catholic spin. So in Latin America, with left-wing Marxist guerrillas, they come out with liberation theology. If you go to Brazil, you see in the Catholic churches, they basically baptize the African animist faiths in parts of Brazil and call their demons, they're now called saints. And as you go around the world, you see that Catholicism baptizes and sanctifies with a Catholic veneer the ideologies or the faiths of wherever they happen to be. And so I think that the Catholic way of conquering is not just through persecution, but more insidiously, it's through amalgamation or incorporation with a new veneer on it. So in that sense, I think that the Catholic Church can easily work with the Marxists. The Catholics work with the Communist Party of China as much as they did with the Nazis in World War II.
Yep.
Yes.
Can I make a comment?
Yes, Dr. Gane.
In light of that, that's very...
Your microphone.
Microphone is... Are we on?
Yes.
Yeah. In light of that, it's very interesting. In Adventist eschatology, we regard end-time Babylon in Revelation 17 and so on as consisting of the papacy and spiritualism and apostate Protestantism, right? Now, spiritualism, occult, is paganism. Would you agree with that? And
Obviously.
Obviously. And at the same time, ancient Egypt, which was not Ellen White refers to it as atheistic in that it was against the true God. They were really polytheists. They were pagans. They were anti-theists in terms of against the true God. So my question is this: if the king of the north is the papacy and the king of the south is spiritualism, paganism, the same as Egypt, atheism, why would they fight each other?
Okay, I see the dragon, spiritualism, differently. Actually, spiritualism is controlled by all three. All three are characterized by spiritualism because it says, I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, three evil spirits like frogs. So they're all controlled by spiritualism. It's the glue that brings them together. What does the dragon represent? We always say the dragon represents spiritualism, but really Ellen White defines in Testimonies to Ministers the dragon as kings, rulers, the kings and rulers of the world. The dragon in Revelation chapter 12 is Satan, yes, but working through Rome. The dragon during the 1260 years persecutes the woman, but that's Satan through papal Rome. And at the end of time, the land beast speaks as a dragon, which means it's going to speak like Rome. So in other words, all three are controlled by spiritualism. It's the glue. But really the dragon represents the political powers of the world. So you have these three powers joining forces. the kings, and you have the false prophet, and you have the beast that are mentioned in Revelation 16, verse 13. And that's picked up in Revelation 17 with different symbolism. In Revelation 17, it's no longer the beast, it's the harlot. No longer is it the beast from the earth or the false prophet, it's the daughters. No longer is it the dragon, but the kings of the earth. And the reason why that it changes terminology is because it wants to make a connection with Babylon in chapter 17. So
I agree with you on all of that. My question is about Daniel 11, verse 40, because if the king of the north is attacked, which is the papacy, is attacked by the king of the south, and the king of the south is atheism or secularism, which is essentially one with pagan and occult, all controlled by this dragon figure, then it seems like they would be allies rather than the king of the south attacking the king of the north. It doesn't make really very good ideological sense to me. It seems to make more sense that it would be something outside of that would be attacking the king of the north.
Yeah, the way I see it is that Daniel chapter 11, verse 40, when it speaks about the king of the south, it's not referring merely to atheism, as I shared with my presentation. It starts with atheism, which basically secularizes France. But it continues because the time of the end has a starting point, but it's also a period after that starting point. It then becomes all the nations of the West now withdraw their support from the papacy, and they establish representative governments, democratic governments. And so now the papacy is inactive, the papacy is bound or with a deadly wound. So the deadly wound is healed when the king of the south, which would represent all of these nations that originated with the spirit of the French Revolution, now restore the power to the papacy. And then, beginning with verse 41 through verse 43, you have the onslaught of the king of the north recovering his power and conquering the king of the south. So it's broader than just the atheism of France. It begins there, but then, like the papacy fell in 1798, but it still exists in the time of the end. It still has a role to play.
I'm understanding you, but if the king of the south now is the secular powers, including now the United States, which is in the spirit of the French Revolution, we all agree with that, that it's been withholding, then at the time, then there's a final battle at which the papacy defeats the United States and all of the other the secular powers. Is that what I'm hearing?
But it defeats it not militarily.
Oh.
It defeats the United States by getting the United States to enact laws that contradict its Constitution. If I could just share here a moment, see if I can find this.
I think a helpful analogy would be the Roman writer Tertullian complains that while Rome had conquered Greece militarily, Greece conquered Rome culturally. And the assault, let's assume that 1798 and the French Revolution taking out the papacy, which was a historical event, that was the first contact between them. But as we go later through that chapter, we see that the papacy, in a reinvigorated form, actually is in alliance with these otherwise that were then secular states. They now lend them lend the papacy their authority.
Yeah, with regard to the United States, some people think, well, the last power that's going to rule is the second beast of Revelation 13, because it comes after the first beast that had the deadly wound. However, the entire purpose of the second beast of Revelation 13 is to restore the power of the first beast. And that's why, let me give you a list. The land beast will speak like a dragon. Well, who was the dragon that tried to slay the man-child? Satan through Rome. Who was the dragon that persecuted the woman for 1,260 years? Revelation 12 says it was the dragon that persecuted the woman. So Rome, the United States, is going to exercise the power of the dragon of Rome to persecute God's people at the end of time. And then we have the land beast exercises all of the authority of the first beast. It forces everyone to worship the first beast. It does everything in the presence of the first beast. It makes an image of the first beast. These are all things in Revelation 13. It will make an image in honor of the first beast. It will enforce the mark of the first beast. And Revelation 19, verse 20, tells us that it will deceive by signs and wonders people to receive the mark of the beast. So everything that this beast does, this second beast, is to cater to the first beast and restore power to it. So the papacy is not going to conquer the United States militarily because they have no tanks and they have no nuclear weapons. It is going to be through artifice, and that's what Daniel 11 describes. This as a deceptive power that wins not by military might, but wins by craft.
All right, so we have a couple of other questions. Dr. Perry, you have a question for us, and then come forward here.
You're a little bit hitting on my question. I'm seeing that where we're talking about entities and powers that are coming up against papal Rome, you know, whether it's Islam, whether it's atheism, whether it's communism. But to me, a bigger force is the United States Constitution and the First Amendment and the separation of church and state. Where do you see those in Daniel 11?
You don't have, you can't stay in just one prophecy. You have to look at all of the cumulus of descriptions in Scripture. Like, for example, if you read Daniel 7, you'll never know that the little horn is going to have a second period. Even Daniel 8, it's not clear that it's going to have a second period of dominion. Where do you have to go to know that it is? You have to go to Revelation 13. The same is true with the man of sin of 2 Thessalonians 2. That doesn't give you the complete picture. You have to go to description in Daniel 11. You have to go to Daniel chapter 8. In other words, you have to take a look at all of the passages that deal with the Antichrist. This system is called the little horn, the beast, the abomination of desolation, the Antichrist, the harlot, the king of the north. It's given many different names. And to get a complete picture, you have to look at all of the passages and then relate them to one another. So what is not in Daniel 11, we'll find in other places where you deal, and you're not taking things out of context, you're studying passages that deal with the same historical period and the same power that we're talking about in Daniel 11.
All right, thank you. Next guy here, raise your hands for Todd. And thank you very much, Todd, for helping us in this way.
Yes. Yes, my name's Tim Hayden. Thank you for coming all this distance, Pastor Board, to be with us and sharing what you know about Daniel 11. I really appreciate that. I have one question. In the great controversy in the Time of Trouble chapter, Ellen White links the making of a death decree and the appearance of Satan. And the question that I have is, do you see that at all in Daniel 11 in your studies of the appearance of Satan?
Okay, I don't see in Daniel chapter 11 the counterfeiting of the second coming of Christ. For that, you have to go to Matthew 24, which is where Ellen White describes she doesn't say the impersonation, she says the personation of Christ. And the description that she gives is amazing. When she describes how Satan's going to counterfeit the second coming of Christ. And by the way, that is after the close of probation.
Yes.
The counterfeit second coming is not before the close of probation, it's after. We know that for two reasons. The first reason is that Ellen White has it in the chapter on the time of trouble, after the close of probation. The second reason is that Matthew 24 is in chronological order. It has all of the main events, end-time events, in the order in which they're going to occur, one event after another. And in Matthew chapter 24, verse 21, it says there will be then great tribulation. The word tribulation appears twice in Matthew 24. It appears in verse 9, unqualified. You will have tribulations, and you will be hated by all nations, and they will kill some of you. That's what Ellen White calls a little time of trouble. But when you get to verse 21, after the abomination of desolation is set up, which is the Sunday law, in verse 21, it says the megale tribulation, the great tribulation. And then immediately after that, it says, then, if someone says to you, it's the word tote in Greek, which according to the lexicon means this event happens after this one and this one after this one. Matthew 24 is in chronological order. Then it says, then if somebody says he is in the desert or he's in the inner rooms, don't go out. So, does that help?
Yes, it helps, yes. One thing I've noticed, Ellen White talks about that when the Satan
Brother
appears.
Tim, microphone up.
Yeah, when Satan appears, he comes in the garments of royalty and with majesty. And the king of the north described in verse 45
Good point.
is, with majesty.
Yeah.
And so anyways, I just linked that, but yeah, I think it's something that needs to be studied
excellent
more.
point. Yeah. I hadn't thought about that, but that's a good point.
Yeah.
It's interesting, Pastor Boyd raised that point about the appearance of Satan. And yesterday we touched on this briefly with 2 Thessalonians 2, the parousia of the lawless one. But as we were talking about it yesterday, some of the people came up to me and said, like, where are you getting this from, the appearance of Satan? And I went straight to Revelation chapter 12 and verse 18, which says, and the dragon took his stand on the sand of the seashore. And they turned in their Bibles and they said, oh, that isn't in our Bibles. And it's not in the King James. That verse just doesn't appear in the King James Version, but it doesn't appear in the majority text, but it appears in the Alexandrian and the eclectic text. And so you have, in Revelation 13, you have the dragon, who's an apostate son, and the dragon is Satan, that's the father. You have the papacy is a fake son, and America fulfills the role of the fake spirit. You have this fake trinity throughout Revelation 13, but that's based on this verse 12:18, that the dragon took his stand on the sand of the seashore before the peoples of the world. And it was an interesting thing to me yesterday for people to come up to me and say, we've never seen that verse before because it's not in the King James. And I said, well, read it. There are other versions out there.
If I could just mention one other thing.
Yes.
People will object and they'll say, Satan pretty much knows the group that have been sealed that are going through the time of trouble because they're praying to the Lord and agonizing before God, which I'm going to preach on tomorrow. The parable of the persistent widow applies to this very moment. The parables of Christ are very eschatological. And so what they say is, well, what good would it do for Satan to counterfeit the second coming of Christ after the close of probation if he knows that he's not going to be able to deceive God's people? And my answer is this: he does it because the devil is the devil. Let me give you an example. Does Satan know that after the millennium, when the wicked resurrect, he's not going to be able to conquer the city?
Yes.
If he doesn't, he's not very smart, because he can read Revelation chapter 20. So here's the question. Why is he going to gather all the wicked, surround the city, prepare military weapons, and get ready to attack the city? Because the devil is the devil, and he doesn't give up. And so even though Satan knows that he's not going to be able to deceive the elect, he says, maybe just this once, I'll be able to counteract the word of God and go against what God says.
All right, we have a question from Pastor Rosenberg. Then I've got a couple from online here. So, Pastor Rosenberg.
When you're taking the great controversy from the French Revolution on through, I think we all see that same sweep in history. And it is I can see its allusions to Daniel 11. And I would agree with you that Ellen White never specifically goes into this because of the conflict between James and Uriah Smith. But with that said, it would be the same reason she also doesn't say anything about Islam, because it would stir up the same conflict. Now, I think there's some things here in Ellen White's writings that haven't been brought to bear yet. First, manuscript 176, 1899. The time has come for Daniel to stand in his lot. The time has come for the light given him to go to the world as never before. If those for whom the Lord has done so much will walk in their light, their knowledge of Christ and the prophecies relating to him will be greatly increased as they near the close of this earth's history. My point here is, in 1899, after she wrote the book Great Controversy, she said there will be a great increase in the understanding of Daniel just before the coming of Christ. Now,
The evidence is this symposium.
Agreed. She also makes an indirect reference to Islam that's very interesting. The God who gave Daniel, again it's related to Daniel, instruction regarding the closing scenes of this earth's history will certainly confirm the testimony of his servants, as at the appointed time they give the loud cry. That's tied to Daniel and the loud cry. All the messages given from 1840 to 44 are to be made forcible now. For there are many people who have lost their bearings. The messages are to go to all the churches. The message was given, and there should be no delay in repeating the message, for the signs of the times are fulfilling. The closing work must be done. A great work will be done in a short time. That would be the loud cry. I think we'd all agree on that. A message will soon be given by God's appointment that will swell into a loud cry. Then Daniel will stand in his lot. Then she explains what she means by 1840. At the very time specified, Turkey, which is an Islamic power, through her ambassadors accepted the protection of the allied powers of Europe and thus placed herself under the control of the Christian nations. The event exactly fulfilled the prediction. When it became known, multitudes were convinced of the correctness of the principles of prophetic interpretation adopted by Miller and his associates, and a wonderful impetus or power was given to the Advent movement. Men of learning and position united with Miller, both in preaching and in publishing his views, and from 1840 to 44, the work rapidly extended. So in 1840, we have a predicted fall of Islam, the Ottomans. It sparks a prophetic movement, the Millerites. They proclaim the judgment and the coming of Christ, only they were wrong on the last part. There will be a repeat, which would be a fall of Islam, a prophetic movement. Jesus does come.
Where does it say that there's going to be a repeat?
I just read it. All the messages given from 1840 to 44 are to be made forcible now.
Are to be what?
That's very general. Many times Ellen White uses the word all.
I know, but again, the message of 1840 was a prophetic message about the fall of Islam. And if she's not going to be direct about Daniel 11:40 to 45, you wouldn't expect her to be direct on this either because of Uriah Smith. It's the same argument. And what I'm saying is not to argue against you. What I'm saying is, when I look closely at Revelation 11, it is the ally of the king of the south. These two powers work together. It is not the king of the south.
I understand your point.
And so I'm just saying these powers end up working together. The Daniel 11 king of the south comes all the way through history, and between right around 1798, the United States comes up as an ally of the papacy, eventual ally of the papacy, and secular, atheistic, Marxist, whatever you want to look at it, out of the French Revolution ends up working with the king of the south.
Yeah, I understand. That's where the 2 points of view come. So
I'm not saying, I'm saying I believe they should end up being united in the one point of view.
Right. Okay. Appreciate that.
Yeah, speaking as an Englishman, I would say that France had a massive role in the establishment of the United States. French atheism, Voltaire, French military aid. We can say that atheism is linked with radical Islam. That is true philosophically. I agree with you on that. But you can also say historically that France is America's closest historical ally. and without French help, maybe the revolution may not have succeeded. And of course, it was
Right.
an English revolution because there were English settlers fighting against the German Hessian mercenaries of George II. So it was an English victory, brother. But we will just move on here. We have a very fair point, brother Pastor Rosenberg. We have a couple of questions I want to get to very quickly. One is for Dr. Gane. It's from John Whitcomb. And it's this: the raw data of the text from verse 25 through to 39 does not explicitly mention the King of the North by name. Is it true that in a scholarly exegetical examination of these verses, 25 through 39, the phrase King of the North would be absent because that phrase is not in the original text? Yeah, that's a question
That's
for you.
yours.
Yeah. So the raw data of the text from 25 through 39 does not explicitly mention the phrase the King of the North.
Can I go now?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Pastor Boer. So we're just transitioning to the next stage here, but the raw data of 25 through 39, the question from Elder Whitcomb, does not mention explicitly the phrase the King of the North. Is it true that in an exegetical examination of these verses, the phrase King of the North would be absent because that phrase is not in the original text? He's suggesting maybe that we supply the phrase the King of the North when it's not actually there in the text.
Oh, there I'm on. It's not a matter of supplying anything. We don't want to supply anything on the text. But what we do see that is there's a continuation, as Tarsee Li was pointing out this morning, of anaphoric reference to what was already named in the past. And earlier we had the King of the North, and then we just had this unbroken succession. Mm-hmm. And so it's King of the North. And then the fact that he stirs everything against the King of the South implies that he's the King of the North. Mm-hmm. So it's an implication, and it's on the basis of the unbroken succession.
So it's there by implication, and it's not straight eisegesis.
Oh, absolutely not. No, it's implication. Can I ask a couple of questions of Elder Boer? I had a couple of questions about his paper. One is, well, let me make this clarification, Elder Boer. In your paper, you said this: those who have embraced this view, that is the radical Islam view, have concluded that the war against Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and ISIS, as well as radical Islamic terrorist attacks in the West, are so significant that they must be contemplated somewhere in Bible prophecy. I don't think anyone has that idea at all. There's no idea that because something is so significant in history or in the news that it must be in Bible prophecy is completely out of line. I mean, how important is Adolf Hitler or Mao Zedong, who killed more people, or Genghis Khan? We don't contemplate that because we think they're important, they must be in prophecy. Now, the other point I'd raise is that this clarification is that only some of us who have come to the Islam conclusion about verses 40 to 43 think that it's radical Islam. That's our friend Tim Rosenberg. Some of the rest of us see the possibility of Islam in general. And at lunch we were discussing, Conrad Vine had a great analogy between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, both of whom had the same goal, but through different means. So some of the rest of us, at least myself, I don't make a distinction between radical Islam and Islam in general. During the Crusades, it was the Islamic powers in general, and that could come back. Now that's one issue, just for clarification on our view.
But I just want to say thanks for the clarification. Much appreciated.
Sure. And then, but there's a question I have about one of the comments of Ellen White that you raised, and this is a very, very important one. And I appreciated very much your presentation in grappling with what Ellen White says and then analyzing it. This is a great idea, and it's a great idea then to look at Revelation and the Great Controversy, because they're all covering a parallel period of history, and to analyze and see where things might fit. I think it's a great idea. I don't agree with all of your conclusions about where they fit, because we'll talk about the issue of comparison and where this kind of intertextual analysis comes in relation to text exegesis of Daniel 11 itself. But I appreciate what you did with these on Ellen White. And here my question is this. In the second reference, Ellen White used the expression, the 11th chapter of Daniel. And she wrote in 1909, which is 111 years roughly after 1798. She wrote, "The world is stirred with a spirit of war. The prophecy of the 11th chapter of Daniel has nearly reached its complete fulfillment." Now, in reading that, I just get the impression that there's some relationship between the chapter of Daniel 11 almost reaching its complete fulfillment and war. And she's talking here about not ideological war, she's talking about military war. This is a few years before the First World War, like 5 years before. And so it was literally true that there was this literal war. So why would she say this if 1798 was a military event where the atheistic France through Berthier, Napoleon's general, took the Pope Pius captive, and so on. This is real war, okay? That's war. But if that's all in the past, that's all done in 1798. Now we're 111 years after that, and now there's only an ideological battle to be fulfilled. Why would she say the world is stirred with the spirit of war? The prophecy of the 11th chapter of Daniel has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. It doesn't make sense to me that she would say that in this context, if it's just an ideological battle after this, that it's going to be the papacy overcoming the United States and the West through ideology. If there's no real war involved, why would she say that?
Well, the fact is that the papacy does not have any military power. But Ronald Reagan, for example, had a lot to do with the overthrow of communism in the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Union. But behind this was an ideology of the Roman Catholic system wanting to get rid of the enemy that they had. So it's not either military weapons or ideological. The ideological is used in 1798 as well as overthrowing, the Soviet Union in the 80s. So anyway, it's not one or the other. It can be both.
Yes, absolutely. I think we all agree that ideology always goes with military, always. Since the beginning of dawn of civilization, you always have ideology and rationalizations and justifications for war. However, you seem to be, is that reading the newspaper now into the text? Because you're saying the fall of the communist bloc, the Soviet Union in 1989 or so, is fulfilling then this text here. Are you really saying that communism is the king of the South, or atheism in the form of communism is the king of the South? Now, it's true that Mussolini did say regarding the Pope, how many divisions does he have? And he didn't mean like North American division and inter-American division. He doesn't have political power like that, military power. But it's always worked through surrogates, always, Christendom, through Europe. And then at the end, there's end-time Babylon, there's the United States, as you pointed out, the land beast works through that. But then working through that power, then he attacks and has conflict with other powers. So there's real war going on. So what is the real war that Ellen White is talking about here? That is to say military war, where, there's casualties in body bags.
Yeah, no doubt about it, that she's describing a military war. Is she describing the First World War, the Second World War, the Vietnam War, the Korean War? Is she just speaking about war in general? Or in the context, is she speaking about war in the context of the papacy recovering its power through the instrumentality of the United States? That's the way I see it.
Well, in the context, she's saying, what I hear her saying is that the prophecy of the 11th chapter of Daniel regarding war has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. In other words, by putting those two sentences in juxtaposition, she's not talking about any war. She's talking about war that completes the fulfillment of Daniel 11. That's the kind of war she's talking about in this context. Otherwise, she wouldn't say it in that context. I don't see that. It's just too close together.
Well, if you were to take that view, that would exclude the Islam view.
How so?
Well, if the physical wars have already nearly reached their complete fulfillment in 1904, how is it we're still looking for fulfillment of Islamic militarism in 2021?
That's a great question, and some of us, Dr. Younker has worked on this and others. And that's a great question. If Ellen White started to say in 1883, she said it several times, you know what I'm saying, that Christ could have come ere this. E-R-E means before this, okay? She said it again in, going right up to 1909, which is the same year here. And how could this have been fulfilled if Islamic power were the king of the South? How could it be fulfilled in Ellen White's day? That's an interesting question. That's an important question. And I think Dr. Randy Younker has found the United States was at loggerheads with Islamic power. I mean, where do you think we got the Marines? From the shores, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of what? Tripoli. The Marines were developed because we fought the Barbary pirates, and that was against North African Islamic power. And the leader of the, Randy can quote better than I can, there was a conversation in writing between Thomas Jefferson was it, and was it the Khalif, or one of those high guys? And he was basically saying that our goal is to defeat you and wipe you out. It might have been John Adams, or one of those two guys. Big dialogue there. Yeah. So that's something that we can't say that, therefore, we have to rule that out.
All right, so let's move on now. We have a bunch of scholars here. We'd like to invite, Pastor Bohr, but if you can be speaking, just a quick brief answer to that. We want to invite some people up to the front here. Then we'll continue with the next stage of our meeting.
I just want to make a comment about the way I see Ellen White when she said that Christ could have come shortly after 1844. She has statements. He could have come in 1883 or in 1888. The way I see it is, does God have a date for the second coming on his calendar? He has a date for his second coming on his calendar. He knows when Jesus is going to come back. But he put that date depending on when he knew that his people were going to be ready. So could he have come, would he have put that date on the calendar if he knew that his people were going to be ready in 1883? Of course. Or if he knew that they were going to be ready in 1888? Of course. He could have come if his people had been ready. But his people were not ready, and God knew it, and that's the reason why he didn't place that date on his calendar. So we have to look at it from the perspective of God and also from the perspective of us.
All right, thank you very much, Elder Bohr. So, Professor Li, would you mind coming up to the front here? And Dr. Carlos Martin, I saw him a minute ago.
Yeah, we have Michael Younker, I think he's on our panel too.
Yes.
And we have online, on Zoom, we have Frank Hardy, we have Daniel Olario, and Oliver Glanz. Let's see if Oliver Glanz has joined us yet.
He's not with us yet.
Oliver Glanz isn't with us yet. Daniel Olario is an expert on Daniel. I'll just introduce him since he hasn't been here. I don't know, you can't see him up there. Daniel Olario is from Romania, teaches right now at Cernica at the Romanian Adventist Seminary. He just recently finished his PhD at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in the area of textual criticism of the book of Daniel. So he wrote his dissertation on the Theodotian recension of the book of Daniel, and his dissertation passed without revisions. Okay, that's impressive, but under Emmanuel Tove and Michael Siegel, two of the most exacting scholars in the world, and the top experts in textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible. So Daniel Olario is a real Daniel scholar and knows a lot more about some aspects of Daniel than the rest of us do about the text of Daniel and its history. And so we're very glad that he is here. And then Oliver Glanz was going to be here too. He had COVID, so he was going to be here with us physically, but he's going to contact with us Zoom. I'll just check in on him to make sure he is coming. So we look forward to a lively discussion here, and Dr. Vine is going to be the moderator. Okay.
right, so we have a number of questions here. Let me just see. Okay, I see our folks on the screen there. There's a number of areas we want to cover, and the first of those is, as we've gone through this conference, we've seen very different approaches to prophetic interpretation. We've seen some presenters focusing such as, welcome Dr. Carlos, and Dr. King, could you give an introduction for Dr. Carlos?
I didn't. No, I'm sorry. That was my fault. Dr. Carlos was teaching at IAS, which is the Adventist Institute of Advanced Studies in the Philippines, and now he's teaching at Montemorelos, at our seminary there in Montemorelos. Dr. Carlos, what is your specialty? What kinds of classes do you teach at Montemorelos?
Well, I have been working always with Old Testament, and I wrote my dissertation on some expressions in Daniel 11. Thank you.
That's good.
Yes, I am Old Testament professor, and I wrote my dissertation on some expressions of Daniel 11 in the glorious land and the glorious holy mountain, also 8 verse 9. I work under Dr. Humberto Raúl Treyer. He was a very committed scholar, and he worked a lot also with chapter 11. But he passed away already some years ago. And now I'm teaching, yes, Old Testament courses there in the Montemorelos now.
Very good. Welcome. Glad you're here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So we're going to start out by having a general discussion about the different approaches to interpretation, because as we've gone through these last 2.5 days, we've seen different presenters bring very, very different approaches to the text. Just to give you an example, Elder Ken LeBrun spoke. He was bringing a very historical approach to the text and looking at the literal fulfillment of that. There was a lot of agreement I saw between that and the Islam view as well. There were some areas of common understanding there. When Elder Nelson spoke, who's with us now, he's been, since 2018, focusing on a more typological approach to the interpretation of Daniel 11, particularly after verse 23 onwards, after what most people consider to be the death of the Messiah, the Prince of the Covenant. And then Professor Dr. Tarsee Li, when you spoke this morning, I'm not sure what kind of firestorm you were walking into, but you were very much focused on more biblical studies. Let's look at the actual text itself, the words, the syntax, the grammar itself, and how does that inform the understanding of the text itself. You might say that's from a biblical studies perspective. And then we have the Elder Dr. Frank Hardy, who is with us. I see him on the screen there. And Dr. Frank Hardy brings, his background is in linguistics, but he brings certainly a linguistic approach, but also more of a structuralist approach. Last year, Dr. Hardy gave an excellent presentation on where Christ appears in Daniel 10, 11, and 12, and using the structure of where Christ is in these 3 chapters to inform the understanding of the individual verses. So you might say that's a literary and structural understanding of the text. Elder Stephen Bohr was just speaking this morning and this afternoon, and he was asking the question. We asked him to ask the question. He didn't just say, I'm going to do this. We asked him to look at these texts from the perspective of the spirit of prophecy. And so that you might say is intertextual, that we're looking at one passage that may be obscure, and so a well-established Adventist hermeneutic is to interpret the obscure passages in the light of the clearer passages, not just in Scripture, but sometimes also in the spirit of prophecy as well. So there was, we've had typological, and then the exegetical was Dr. Gane's presentation yesterday, looking at Dr. Michael Younker as well, looking at the text itself, what do we exegete from the text. We've had theological, and we've had analysis in the light of the spirit of prophecy. We've also had an historical review and a literary and a structural analysis of the text. And to a lay person like myself, it just seems that we have all these different approaches, and we have all these different tools in the tool bag, but we don't always come to the same conclusion. And so the question is, which of these methods has priority over another method? what is the normal process we would use to gain an understanding of the text, because we have all these different approaches. And so what is, from a methodological perspective, what would your recommendations be as a panel of scholars for how we approach the text, given that everybody's approaching it in such a different way? Maybe we'll start with Professor Dr. Li. Would you maybe start us off? And Frank, I see you're online there, and Dr. Oliaro, if you want to speak, just kind of raise your hand there, and we'll bring you into the conversation.
Okay, is this on? Yeah, I guess it is. Well, I would say that before you interpret what the text means, you have to come to an agreement on what the text actually says. And so that would be the very first step. Mm-hmm. And beyond that, I'm not sure that there is one specific order, because you have to come back and forth. It's like when you look at it theologically, it may shed light on something biblical that you may have to take a second look at, and so on. So it's always a dialogue. It's a dialogue that never ends, I think. But I think we have to begin by agreeing on what the text actually says.
All right, thank you. Dr. Carlos?
Yes, I share in my book some principles how to interpret not only this passage, many passages in the Bible. And yes, first we should work with the text, and I think if not all of us are trying to do that, working with the text, with the grammar, and I did that with this chapter, the whole chapter, and I present the arguments why I suggest some kind of paragraphs that have a special meaning. But I quote there Roundtable that he said that exegesis by itself is not enough. Because if you work only with the text and you do the syntactical analysis and semantic this and that, it's not enough. Because we can take the risk to be very literal and go like the evangelicals, that they are very literal in their interpretation of many prophecies of the Old Testament. So he suggests that we should work also with theological exegesis. It means to go to other passages to understand what is the meaning of those, or many expressions there. Let's say Ammon, Moab, Edom. We should go to the Bible first to see who were those countries or those nations in the past, in order to give a possible meaning for now. It's not that we look for the meaning of these provinces only because I think this is this or that. Another element that I think that Roundtable did a great contribution is that before the cross, I don't know, I have not heard about this here, but before the cross, the interpretation was more geographical, literal geographical. But after the cross, we have a change. We have now and we should be very careful about, I have learned this about along the years, the words we use, because if you say symbolic, somebody can take it in some way. You say spiritual. I heard someday a discussion about that. But maybe, yes, the way to say is that after the cross, we should interpret all the symbols in a spiritual way, if this may be the best way to say it. And there are different principles that we should take with us when we are studying the prophecy. Let's say the role of Israel and what the New Testament says about Israel, the literal Israel. We should also consider all these elements when we are doing the interpretation, especially of this passage, like Daniel 11. We put all these tools together, and then we can move ahead with the work.
So what I'm hearing you say, and also Dr. Li, is that we start with asking what the text actually says, the original language, but even the process of exegesis does not happen in a vacuum. There has to be a theological, there has to be an intertextual cross-referencing with other passages in Scripture in order to come to a full understanding of this.
Yeah, one more detail I will suggest is we should consider what gender we are working with. It means Daniel 11 is in the context of apocalyptic, and the apocalypticism, one of the elements are the symbols. We should interpret those symbols. It's not that we are imposing the text, it's that the kind of gender we have there is requesting us to try to understand those a lot of symbols, and this is the one complicated thing on Daniel 11. There is many symbols there, many elements to interpret.
We have Dr. Daniel Olaru, his hand is raised. So, Dr. Daniel, if you could unmute yourself, we look forward to hearing your contribution.
Yeah, let's check. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, perfect. So first of all, I want to thank you for this wonderful conference. I am really sorry that I'm not there, first of all, but also I'm sorry that I couldn't have my time to read everything what you uploaded on the website, and also to follow physically, because also I struggle with COVID. But thanks God we are well, and I could make it to be present in this format. So I want to thank Professor Gane that he introduced me to this conference, and I hope in the future to contribute to the next conferences that you are planning to have. So regarding your question about the methods, there are a variety of methods, exegetical methods, and I think it was a Jewish scholar, Weiss, I don't know the other name, that he used the term total exegesis. I've noticed that also Dr. Gane used it, this term, and let's say when we refer to total exegesis, we acknowledge that there are various methods that we have at our hand to use to study the Bible. Dr. Li made reference that we have to understand the text using languages. I can argue from my side that studying variants, textual variants, is also very important to establish the text before everything else. But also structuralism, trying to figure out what is the best structure of a passage also can illuminate the text. And we have also sometimes that we have to do some word studies, because the meaning of the text resides in the particular word or idiom that is in the text. Sometimes we have to do theological, to analyze themes and theology of a book, or a theme to follow it throughout the Bible to understand the meaning of a text. By saying that, when I have all these methods at our hand, not always a particular method gives us the best results. For example, at times we can, let's say, by studying variants, it is enough to figure out the meaning of the text. Other times we have to figure out or to produce a better argument, studying the structure of a passage. But there are times when you have to take them together, because the passage is very complicated. So a real exegete will do everything. I mean, will go with the text through all those possibilities to try to figure out what would be the meaning of the text. And by saying that, it doesn't mean that at the end of this difficult process, we'll get to the clear meaning of the text. And it is possible that many exegetes that are very serious, very devoted, and also trying to leave aside their biases, they can find, they can reach to an interpretation that differs from the other's interpretation. So now when you have a plurality of interpretations, what is the best? How do you decide among them? And I recall that a conversation that I had with my mentors when we discussed about how it is possible that several people using the same method, but still getting different conclusions. And the answer was, one of my, Michael Siegel said, Daniel, don't worry, in a scholarship you'll never get to a full agreement among the opinions. And after we discussed this, we discussed about this, why you can use the same method but arriving to different conclusions. Still, he completed, he continued and said, but even though there are many opinions or many interpretations, you'll notice that all the time it will be an interpretation that it's stealing the show. I mean, it's more clear than the others. And the readers, they can decide about the clarity, about the easiness, how it is proposed, and it will have something which is more, better presented and better argued than the other theories. So I would say, I would like to, where I prefer this term thoughtful exegesis, referring that we have to go through all the methods that can take us to deepen our study. In the same time, don't creating us the illusion that all of us will get to the same conclusion. Sometimes we have to correct our conclusions while reading or interacting with others' conclusions. But at the end, there will be an interpretation or a solution that by itself, it's coming, it's suggesting by itself that is the right or is the more plausible conclusion. In this way, I will answer to your question of using methods.
Okay, thank you. It's an excellent answer, Dr. Lariu. And I'd just like to ask Dr. Younker, you've been using primarily you've done a lot of historical analysis as well as exegesis of the text. Why do you, I know you're a historian by profession, what is it that drives your interpretation of the text?
Well, one thing I think that has been neglected in a lot of the studies of Daniel, and I think we've had some good opportunities to look at some of these features and aspects of it even again this year, is that there's this desire to jump to the end and not understand everything that came before. And so in following with what some have already said, we do need to look at the text. We must translate the text correctly before we can even begin to interpret it. It doesn't mean that we may not have interpretations in mind, and of course, we do need to know history as we begin to interpret it, but we must have the text as a whole. And so I think taking the end of Daniel as a lesson, it says that prophecy was sealed, and so it may be true that in general the prophecy was not understood as the events were fulfilled. In most cases, in some cases that may not actually be, there may have been some that were wrestling with it and may have realized they were part of it, and there may be some evidence for that. But in general, that wasn't possible. But now that that is the case, that we are at the end, we believe that it is unsealed. We should be able to understand it now. One thing that we haven't agreed on as well as we should is all of the things before the end. And so by going back to the text, translating it correctly, that allows us to have a better foundation to actually begin to interpret it. Coinciding with that, one other important part of being able to do that is that we actually do need to study history more carefully. A lot of times we have had, if I may say it, speaking as a historian here, even though I am very interested in the text, we have had a lot of biblical scholars or generalists that are not really historical specialists trying to interpret it. And so this is where the historian and the linguist must work together, because we've had a lot of people who are trying to do it all, be generalists and be able to tackle every aspect of everything. And that probably won't work well. We need people that are actually specialists in the possible historical periods, as well as the linguists working together. And this conference is somewhat unique, and it has been over the last few years, in that I think there is some effort, some attempt to try and actually begin to do that where it hasn't been done before. So
yeah, just an interesting thought just struck me that maybe for next year we could ask the pro-Islam group to prepare a case for the Islamic understanding based on the theological and the intertextual perspective. And we could ask the pro-atheism group to prepare their case based on the exegetical side, and actually have each other walk in each other's shoes for a year. And because when you try and argue the case from using somebody else's tools, it may reveal some surprising results. It's easy for me to say that right now, but that would be an interesting exercise, wouldn't it? So we'll come to you, Dr. Gane, in a minute, but I see Dr. Frank Hardy Your thoughts on this, on the various tools we have at our disposal, and the relative primacy, I hate to use that word when we're talking about the papacy, but the relative primacy of the tools that we have at our disposal.
Yes, okay. I think we've gotten some good answers to this question, and I think we've gotten a good level of focus on the text. We all agree on that. That has to be our starting point. I think to answer your question well, I would need to take one step back and ask why we're studying Daniel at all. Why are we studying this book? Why does it hardly matter what Daniel says? And the answer is that God inspired it. But that raises a further question, and that is, well, what else did he inspire? Did he speak on the same topics more than once? Can we benefit from comparing them? So, yes, I believe in total exegesis, but it's not just use this method and that method, and you use a lot of methods, and that's your study. I think we need to canvass the entire range of things that God has said. And when we get through doing that, I think we need to do a reality check against the spirit of prophecy, as Pastor Bohr has done. I really appreciated his approach. It's not the only approach. We should not start with the spirit of prophecy. We should start with the text, and then the context, and then the broader context, and the circles go outward. But we shouldn't stop until we have listened to everything the Holy Spirit has to say on the topic.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Hardy. Dr. Gane?
Yes, all of these are very good comments, and what Dr. Hardy just said about starting with the text and moving outward is very good, and also what Dr. Li said about a conversation that is back and forth. At each stage, you keep coming back to the text and going like this and moving outward, but you have to start with the inner circle first. And then another point I would make is that whenever you're dealing with other aspects that can inform the meaning, that is ultimately to try to find out what the meaning is, typology can be very important, understanding of symbolism can be very important, also, of course, looking at Revelation in intertextuality there, Thessalonians, and also Ellen White. All of these are important. There's none of them that's not important. They're crucial for us to grasp the full picture. And then what Dr. Younker said is that none of us are specialists in it all. This is why we have to work together. And it's very challenging when we each have our specialty and we're working together. We have to figure out where we all fit into each other and our disciplines and so on. This point, however, I think is important in terms of the priority, the order in which we do our work. And that is that whenever you're doing comparative study, there's been a lot of work done on this, comparative study between ancient Near Eastern texts and cultural artifacts and phenomena in archaeology and so on, and in linguistics. And William W. Hallow has done a lot of work on this, and also some others as well. You can read about, there's a wonderful introductory essay by Lawson Younker in one of the volumes of The Context of Scripture, and he's referring to the work of Hallow. And the point is that you have to always analyze very carefully each artifact within its own context before you compare it with something else. Comparison is important, and you learn more about it by comparison. But if you don't look at it carefully enough, analyze it in its own context, like Dr. Li said, what the text says before you know what it means, then you come up with distortion, and you get eisegesis. You're reading it and other things into this context. Now, what Dr. Morris said about the genre is crucial too, because the genre is the apocalyptic genre. However, we have to realize that there can be subgenres of the apocalyptic genre. You can get the symbols as in the beginning of Daniel 8. You can get interpretation of those symbols later on in the chapter. We have to keep all those things in balance and in order. And so working, really, it's a holistic enterprise. In fact, Moshe Greenberg, in the introduction to his Ezekiel 1-20 volume of the Anchor Bible Commentary Series, and I studied under him at Berkeley, so he talked to us about this. He has the idea of holistic exegesis. Holistic, that is, you put it all together. but in putting it all together, you have to take the details into full account. Now, you know when you've made a mistake at one of the later stages of comparison or whatever, if you're ever violating or ignoring or disagreeing with raw data at the initial stage of the text. Or when you're looking at history, if you're violating the raw data of the history. As you know, we talked about Cleopatra and Tiberius and so on, and Augustus. If you're violating the raw data of any of these things, you have a problem. Now, I'll close with this. I think with Uriah Smith, okay, with the early Adventists, James White seems to have been working really with the text. Of course, King James. Uriah Smith comes along with a very historical focus. And the Uriah Smith interpretation was basically a historical, looking at the King James and then looking at history and seeing what could fit. Then the atheism view is a theological view. It's not really an exegetical view so much, well, not in the sense of exegesis bottom up. So the exegesis I deal with and Tarsee Li deals with, and I think Frank Hardy to a large extent, is bottom up, okay? And that is, the atheism view came from a top-down view. And I have colleagues who are top-down, Old Testament theologians. And this is regarded as exegesis, but, and it is in a sense, if it's taking into account the bottom-up details adequately. But the synthesis of all of these different passages is really important. You've got to look at Revelation, the different passages in Daniel, so on and so forth, and Ellen White. But when you make assumptions from the top, and then you impose them on the bottom before you adequately analyze the bottom, then that is not valid methodology. That's a problem. My commitment is not to the Islam view. It's not. I think I made that clear at the end of my presentation. I would just as soon abandon that view. I don't like that view. My commitment is to exegesis, and that is to say, holistic exegesis in the order coming from the text, working up, working outward from there, taking everything into account. That's my commitment.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Gane. We have a question here from Kenneth Daisley. Kenneth, if you want to unmute yourself, we look forward to hearing your question.
I listened to Elder Stephen Bohr, and I saw what his opinion was, and I wondered some things. But I think he made a great effort to try to show Ellen G. White's statements, and I wonder to what extent, God apparently wanted to conceal the prophecies, these last end prophecies of Daniel chapter 11. And there must be a reason why. And I don't think we have sufficiently asked ourselves, why would God want to seal these prophecies? We notice in the book of Daniel, the first time a particular term is mentioned, the time of the end, Daniel is told by the angel to close the book. Not seal, but close. There's a difference between closing and sealing. The tomb of Jesus was closed with a big stone. It would be difficult to remove it. One may need help. But when it is sealed, it tells me that one has to be authorized, and not everyone would be able to open. And the other thing is, I am not sure that I have clarity in terms of when the time of the end started. Ellen G. White herself said somewhere around 1903 that we need to read the 12th chapter of Daniel so we could be ready for the time of the end. She saw it as a future date, although in the past, somewhere in these Arab ages, she's saying it is now fulfilled. So when we see these apparent inconsistencies, we have to ask ourselves several questions. Did she really understand what the time of the end was all about? Was she in league with others believing it's just the last days? Would God tag a period of history and call it the time of the end just for tagging that period of history's sake? What is involved in the time of the end? Do we understand what it means, really? Have we dug into that? Because I see most of the explanations given or the attempts to interpret pivoting around the time of the end because of verse 40. But is there really a true understanding of what is the time of the end? What does it convey? What does it mean? What does it hold for God's people? In the passage it first appears in chapter 8, what is that dealing with? What is the angel really saying?
All right, thank you very much.
And that's my dilemma, yes.
All right, thank you very much. Those are fair questions. Pastor Bo, you're with us. Do we have that microphone? Do we have a spare microphone floating around? No. Okay, Pastor Bo, could you use your preaching voice and just share with us, in answer to Brother Daisy's question, what is the significance of the time of the end for God's people? Okay, so the time of the end begins at a certain point of time. We're just getting Pastor Bo the microphone here.
Yeah, the time of the end begins at a certain point in time, which Great Controversy 356 identifies as 1798, when the papacy had ruled 1,260 years or 42 months. However, the time of the end has a beginning point, but it is a period from that point on. That's why Ellen White can say the 1844 time of the end, or other dates time of the end, because we'll be in the time of the end. The bottom line is that the time 1798 is significant because at that time, the little book of Daniel 12 verse 4 is unsealed. And they begin talking about the judgment, 1844, the judgment near. As I've shown in one of the studies that I did, Daniel is divided really into two books. It's two books in one. The first book is Daniel 1 through 7, and the second is Daniel 8 through 12. Really, the book that was sealed until the time of the end is not all of Daniel. Ellen White refers to it as a portion of Daniel. In another quotation, she says that part of Daniel that has to do with the last days. So from 1798 on, many of the prophecies that were not understood before 1798 would now be understood. So the time of the end begins in 1798, according to what I've been able to determine, and then it is a period during which the study of prophecy will reveal more and more light so that God's people can be prepared for the great events that are going to take place on earth.
So, Brother Stephen, could you read for me this statement, the exact statement she makes with regard to from the Great Controversy?
Yeah,
could you tell me whether it's a deduction you are making or whether she has said emphatically that the time of the end started 1798?
Well, if you mean by emphatically that Ellen White said the time of the end begins in 1798, there's no quotation that says that specifically. Let me see if I can find it here. Give me just a second, and I will look up that quotation.
Pastor Bohr, I have it here, or I have something that would come very close, if I could share this.
Okay, go ahead.
On Great Controversy 592, she says, but the great resurgence of foreign missionary activity begins around the year 1800 at the time of the end. And we have a number of statements that say that the 1260 days end in 1798. Fewer statements that would say the time of the end begins in 1798, but this mentions around the time of the year 1800, which in my mind means 1798 at the time of the end. That's Great Controversy 592.
Now the quotation that I have, thank you, Brother Hardy, good to see you. It's been lots of years since I saw you in New Mexico. But anyway, still remember.
Good memory.
Still have some of your materials in my file.
Okay.
You were a prolific writer even back then. Here's the statement. This is Great Controversy, page 356. The Apostle Paul warned the church not to look for the coming of Christ in his day. That day shall not come, he says, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed. Not till after the great apostasy, which is the 1260 years, and the long period of the reign of the man of sin can we look for the advent of our Lord. The man of sin, which is also styled the mystery of iniquity, the son of perdition, and that wicked, represents the papacy, which, as foretold in prophecy, was to maintain its supremacy for 1,260 years. This period ended in 1798. The coming of Christ could not take place before that time. Paul covers, with his caution, the whole Christian dispensation down to the year 1798. It is in this side of that time that the message of Christ's second coming is to be proclaimed. And then she continues, no such message has ever been given in past ages. Paul, as we have seen, did not preach it. He pointed his brethren to the then far distant future for the coming of the Lord. The reformers did not proclaim it. Martin Luther placed the judgment about 300 years in the future from his day. Now here comes the key point. But since 1798, the book of Daniel has been unsealed. That's critically important. And she's referring to Daniel 12, verse 4. The book of Daniel has been unsealed. Knowledge of the prophecies, we usually use it to, in evangelism to say there's going to be lots of jets and computers and stuff like that. But really, it's talking about knowledge of Daniel. Knowledge of the prophecies has increased, and many have proclaimed the solemn message of the judgment near. So not until the book is unsealed do you have a revelation of the prophecy concerning 1844. And she mentions 1798 three times in this quotation.
Okay, thank you, Elder Bo. That's an excellent response. Dr. Carlos, if you can bring the phone to Pastor Nelson. And maybe, do you want to come and join us back on the platform, Dr. Carlos? We can share the microphones here.
Could I just read a statement that comes from Last Day Events? The
Yes.
statement comes from Last Day Events, page 16. I'm quoting. Andrew White is writing here. Let us read and study the 12th chapter of Daniel. It is a warning that we shall all need to understand before the time of the end. Last Day Events, page 16. What is happening here? Let us read, because we need to make no deductions from this statement. The other statements, we will have to make some deductions. I am reading from Last Day Events, page 16. Those of you who have your devices, you can find at page 16. Let us read and study the 12th chapter of Daniel. It is a warning we shall all need to understand before the time of the end. Last Day Events, page 16. That is very clear to me.
All right. Well, brother, we need to take all of the statements, not just an isolated statement. Pastor Nelson and then Brother Wall. So we'll take these two here.
A couple items. Yesterday, I thought I heard I think everyone had agreed that the time of the end is a period of time. It's a season of time. And it does have a specific starting point. Also yesterday and Wednesday evening, it was brought out the prepositions that come before, that they're going to be persecuted, God's people will be persecuted until the time of the end. In other words, the implication is beginning with the time of the end, the persecution will cease. That did take place in 1798. That the book of Daniel will be unsealed or sealed until the time of the end. Again, that implicates the beginning of the time of the end, which the reference that we just read from the Spirit of Prophecy seems to confirm that. There is one usage in the book of Daniel of the phrase, the time of the end, that I have not heard anyone talk about so far, and it comes from Daniel 8:17. In Daniel 8:17, the angel says, "Son of man, understand that their vision pertains to the time of the end." And it's very interesting that the usage of the preposition there is not "be," which is at the time of the end, as in verse 40, and it's not, what's the other one that's used in verse 35, until, and verse 12:9? It's not that one. This one is lamed, that the vision pertains to the time of the end or belongs to the time of the end. In other words, it doesn't necessarily tie what's happening in this vision to the beginning of the time of the end as some of the other prepositions do, but that what's talking about in this vision, that it refers to what's going to happen during the time of the end. And I think the statement that Ellen White is making is that we're going to need to understand some of these things before the end of the time of the end. I don't think she's using this as in a technical sense, as in the way that Daniel is using it. I think she's using this generally, and I think a lot of the data we brought out kind of bears that out.
Okay, thank you very much, Pastor. Brother Wall, you had a comment on this?
I'm going to piggyback on what Pastor Nelson had just mentioned. I believe that particular quotation is pertaining to the end of the time of the end. Because if you're talking about, she's already, some of the quotations that she's mentioned, 1798, are also mentioned in chapter 12, where it's talking about 1260, 1290, 1335. They all start before the 1798. So I believe what she is mentioning there is pertaining to the standing up of those four things that Pastor Bohr just mentioned today. Those things are what she's referring to. We need to understand the issues, those four issues, before the end of the time of the end, as it is being mentioned. Okay. So it's not, she's not talking about, when the time of the end begins. She's talking about in this context of the quotation by the person. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Gane. And then we have is your hand up at the back, brother? Okay, we'll take you next after Dr. Gane's point.
In listening to the quotation that Elder Bohr read just a moment ago from Ellen White, perhaps you could read that one more time and then have a comment on it. That last quotation you read. If that's not too much difficulty. Just a little bit that you mentioned before, yeah.
Let's see. Speaking about the 1260 years, she says this period ended in 1798. The coming of Christ could not take place before that time. Paul covers with his caution the whole Christian dispensation down to the year 1798. It is this side of that time that the message of Christ's second coming is to be proclaimed. No such message has ever been given in past ages. Paul, as we have seen, did not preach it. He pointed his brethren into the then distant future for the coming of the Lord. The reformers did not proclaim it a little bit further ahead. But since 1798, the book of Daniel has been unsealed. Knowledge of the prophecies has increased, and many have proclaimed the solemn message of the judgment near.
Okay. That's it. Many have proclaimed the solemn message of the judgment near. Now, this is interesting because this ties two things together. I think we may have another point of agreement, Dr. Perry, here, because Dr. Hardy used the evidence from the end of Daniel 11:35, for it still awaits until the time of the end. Until the time of the end. Ad 8 cates, until the time of the end. And Dr. Hardy referred to persecution, the end of persecution at that time. And then Tim Rosenberg mentioned to me, and I referred to this, that it could refer to the judgment that's coming, which ties in with 8:17. Now, what I'm hearing from this quotation from Ellen White is that, okay, there's the end of persecution, there's the unsealing of the book of Daniel, and there's also the preaching of the message of the judgment coming. Okay? Looking ahead, which is the vindication of the saints. This is in the fifth seal in Revelation, what the persecuted saints, the blood under the altar, are crying out for, the souls under the altar, are crying out for, when will you avenge our blood? Vindicate us, Lord. When is this going to happen? How long until you judge and avenge? Okay? So what I'm seeing here is an introductory period into the period of the time of the end, as we've mentioned before, 1798 to 1844 being an introductory period, And certainly, when Ellen White says that the book of Daniel was unsealed in 1798, it doesn't mean it was totally unsealed. We didn't have higher medicine until 1844, right? Okay, and here we are. We're still working on unsealing the book of Daniel by God's grace. And so it's the beginning of the process. It's a very important beginning, and it continues. And we have, it's not either or. It's not until, that is 1135. It's not just looking forward to the end of persecution or looking forward to the vindication of the judgment. It's looking forward to all of the above. Beginning in 1798, moving ahead through 1844 and beyond. So I think we can agree on that. Can you agree on that, Tim Rosenberg? Okay.
It begins and
I guess
it goes on.
He needs the mic.
You have the introduction. You have a growing understanding from 1798 to 1844 when it hits it in its fullness as far as the understanding of the judgment. Interesting in this comment, on 356 it says judgment near. On 355, talking about the time of the end, it says when the judgment had come. And so it's kind of like a growing to its fullness. That's why I look at 1798 to 1844 as judgment near. That doesn't mean you couldn't have an event at the beginning of that or on either end of it. It's just introduction and the time of the end in its fullness, because Jesus can now come at any time once that judgment has begun, because it just ends and he comes.
All right. Elder Boer has a comment on that. We'll go to, then after him, Pastor Nelson, we'll go to our friend at the back of the church there.
Ellen White mentions what happened after 1798. She mentions names, Joseph Wolfe and others, that Eva Lacunza, who preached that the judgment was near. Of course, in 1844, after the disappointment, it became much clearer that the hour of the judgment had come. And so, but actually the preaching of the judgment hour and the unsealing of Daniel, Ellen White explicitly says that it was in 1798. I mean, she explicitly says it in this quotation in Great Controversy 356. And she quotes Daniel chapter 12 and verse 4.
All right, thank you. Gentleman at the back, if you can raise your hand again. Thank you. Again, just give us your name. I think it's Brother Nathaniel, isn't it? Yes, okay. So, Brother Nathaniel, delighted you're with us. If you can share your question or comment.
I have a quick question. If it was unsealed in 1798, could it be that there is a progressiveness to that unsealing? That means that till the end of time, it would continue to be unsealed as we hear and see what is being presented. Because I remember a quotation from Ellen G. White where she says that God will send light to his people in the time of the end at the time that they need it. I'm just saying perhaps it's a progressive unsealing which began in 1798.
All right, I think that's a fair point, actually. Our understanding did grow as you look through the great disappointments and the Bibles, the Sabbath conferences after the great disappointment. Our understanding has been growing over the years. So
Conrad?
Yes.
Could I comment on this?
Sure. Yes, go ahead.
Frank Hardy here. In my 1983 master's thesis, I tried to make the point. In my 1983 master's thesis, I tried to make the point that unsealing the prophecies is related to fulfilling the prophecies. So as the prophecies are fulfilled, they become unsealed. We need fulfillment in order to understand what was predicted. I call this the Froome hypothesis.
All right, thank you very much. Very helpful points, Dr. Hardy. Okay, which leads us nicely to the next kind of focus, and this actually relates to the timing of the end. And I know we discussed it 2 years ago, but it is significant for the Islam and the atheism views, because the atheism view holds that the Revelation 11, papacy being overthrown by revolutionary France, it happened at a punctiliar point in history, and the Islam view holds that in the time of the end, the king of the south shall push against him, is during the time, sometime after 1798 onwards. So one group argues for a punctiliar fulfillment, and the other argues for a sometime during that time from the 1798 to the coming of Jesus. And so, Dr. Hardy, you maybe you can give us like a 1-minute summary, because some of us were not here on Wednesday night, of your essential point about the Hebrew text used in, I think, 1135 up to the time of the end, and then in or at the time of the end, 1140.
Yes, actually, we could take more than just a moment. We'll see how this flies. The expression is ad et kates, so that means until the time of the end. And in that expression, I think it does mean specifically and exclusively the end of persecution, because of what goes before that in the same sentence. But in verse 40, I don't think we can interpret the preposition "ba" by itself. It's part of an until at pair, ad ba. And I use two texts to illustrate this, but my point doesn't hinge on these texts. Joshua 8:29, and he hanged the king of Ai on a tree until evening, and at sunset Joshua commanded, and they took his body down. So a period of time led up until evening, and then at sunset was a point of time. 2 Chronicles 18:34, they propped Ahab up in his chariot facing the Syrians until evening. Then at sunset he died. Well, until evening, he was there all day. But it doesn't take all day to die. It's talking about the moment. Until evening, then at sunset he died. So that's one thing. More generally, I'm getting some feedback. So
it's Kenneth Dorsey. Kenneth Dorsey, can you mute your microphone? Okay, he's done it. Okay, go ahead, Dr. Hardy.
Okay, all right. This is one example of a handful that we could point to where it's really not possible or feasible to interpret a specific verse in Daniel in isolation. For example, well, I've given you the one example of 35 and 40. So those two passages need to be taken together. It's not enough to look at 40. You need to view 40 in the context of 35. There are some other examples of this. Hopefully it won't constitute a change of topic, but I need to give the context. In 11:16, Habai Lav, Biyas Habai Lav Hirtzono. And if we endeavor to interpret this by itself, we could come to one set of conclusions. But there's something off stage that we need to take into account. And I pointed out, if you take 11, 16, and 17 together, and 9, 26, and 27 together, you get a very nice set of verbal parallels. So we don't need to go through that. But my point is, you need to interpret 11, 16 in the context of something else, 9, 26, and 27. At verse 23, where we have umin hit chabrute lav, and after the agreement with him, it's not just him that we're dealing with. It's not just an anaphoric pronoun. What we need to look for to find a match is a person and also an agreement. So if we go back to verse 22, we have the agreement because it Nagid Barit, it talks about a Barit. But that's not a person that we can apply the evil character of verse 23 to. We can go back one verse before that and find an evil character, but there's no agreement in that verse. And so in my view, you have to go all the way back to 16 and 17. You find the person in 16, the agreement in 17, Visharim Emo, and agreements with him. And so that's another illustration where you can't just interpret one verse by itself. Then I've mentioned verse 40. You have the same thing in 11:45. There's no way to account for the fact that the king comes to his end and with none to help him until we turn to 12:1. You can't account for the end of the king until the king falls. Well, the reason for that is that Michael rises. So you have to take those together. So this is one in a series of cases where you have to look back and bring in additional contextual information. This is not eisegesis, it's completing the process of exegesis.
Thank you.
All right, Roy, and then we'll go to Dr. Tarsee.
I just have one footnote question for you, Frank, and I agree with so much of what you say. Very well said. My question is, if you have the same power going back verse 16 or 15, going all the way through, then who is the daughter of women in verse 17?
The daughter of women in verse 17 is symbolic. You have a dozen examples of the same reference, same type of reference in the Book of Lamentations, which is an entirely contemporary book written by an author whose work Daniel studied. So I take that as a symbolic statement. This is a shot over the bow. Later on, we start to get more figurative language, but that comes gradually toward the end.
So what does it mean to give the daughter of women? Generally, that's a term for giving in marriage in the Hebrew Bible. So what does it mean to give the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom? What would that mean?
Well, to destroy the kingdom is clarified in 927. Let me just see if I still have that. Well, just a moment. Yeah, 927. And on the wing of abomination shall come with him. That's not it. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for them. That's not it. We need 926. Just a moment. Let me get the text up here. Oh. Okay. 9. Bear with me. 926. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood. That's what it's referring to.
So what about the...
In my view, 926 and 27 and 11, 16, and 17 represent shared context. These are two descriptions of one set of events.
Okay, so what about William Miller's rule that Ellen White adopted and the Adventist churches adopted, that we should take something literally as long as it makes sense literally, and only if we are forced to interpret it symbolically should we do that? How are we forced from the idea that in 11:17 this language is, how are we forced to the idea that it's symbolic rather than literal in this context?
You have to set up the little truth table of parallels. Maybe I should just touch on those before we go on. Moment, another sheet of paper here.
Are you able to share your screen with us, Dr. Hardy?
No point. I don't have it on my screen.
All right.
But here, you have to understand that there is a context, that there is a shared context going on. So if you take 11, 16, and 17, and 9, 26, and 27, you get these parallels. Haba elav, nagid haba. V'chala bi'ado, ba'ad kala. V'hashkita, yashkit. So taking only the parallel words, haba, haba, identical. Kala, kala, identical. Lahashkita, yashkit, to destroy, he will destroy, almost identical, both from shachat, both representing the hipil conjugation. So in that context, and that is the context, not just 16 and 17, that's not the whole context. The whole context is 11, 16, and 17 plus 9, 26, and 27, and in that broader context, there's a good matchup between the destruction of the woman and the destruction of the city.
All right, so Dr. Gane, I just want to ask Dr. Li to comment on the original question here. We'll come to you in a moment, Pastor, which was, Dr. Hardy's been talking about verse 35 up to the time of the end, and then verse 40 says, but the time of the end. My Hebrew isn't very good. So your thoughts on that? He's arguing that this is these are they're inclusios, they go together. That one refers to up to the time of the end. These events take place then, but in the time of the end, at a moment in time, this is when it happens. Your thoughts on that?
Is it on? Okay.
Yes.
Just trying to get the actual text in front of me. Yes, you have at the time of the end, I'm scrolling too fast here. You have, let's see, what verse is that? Verse 35. Okay. I would agree with him that the expression in 35, ad 8 cates, does mean a point in time. It's when the persecution ends. So that's definitely correct. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the time of the end is only a point in time. So verse 40 allows for the time of the end to be, a longer duration than just one point in time. I just found another passage here.
Exactly,
Joel,
and
yes. I heard something.
exactly. I'm not saying that the time of the end is a point of time. I'm just saying that it began at a point of time.
Yes.
And then, yes,
correct.
that period
Yes.
follows.
It can.
You are
yes.
right.
Yeah. So I found a passage here in Joel 4:1, using the same expression, but not time of the end, just the time. And it's interesting that it's connected with another expression that's definitely a longer period. Ki hine bayamin ha'hema uva eight hahi. So you have in those days and at that time. So clearly the ba'et in this case, or ba'et, means more than just a point in time, because it includes a certain number of days. So that I thought, and there's some other parallels. But so in verse 40, yes, the time of the end could certainly be a period of time rather than just the end as such.
Okay, thank you. Pastor Nelson, and then Dr. Younker.
My comment was just in regards to what Dr. Hardy had just shared. I had come to the same conclusions that he had on verse 17, that the daughter of women is a reference to Jerusalem for all the same reasons that he just mentioned. So I didn't know that there was anyone else. It was just exciting to me to hear that, because that's what I had seen in the text as well. So that was interesting. I think that bears more investigation.
Can I just suggest, when we have these conferences, sometimes there's emails that go back and forth, thereafter. It'd be very helpful for us, Pastor Nelson, if you were to stay in contact with Dr. Hardy, and just to explore that a bit further. Okay, thank you. Dr. Michael Younker, Randy Younker, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. I don't mind being confused with my son. That's does me well. Just a comment of information that may be interesting. I was thinking, Conrad, of your comment about particular versus the beginning of a process. This particular group, or Adventists in general, may not be aware that in 1798, we usually think of that as the conclusion of the 1260-day prophecy, the fall of the papacy, General Berthet, Napoleon's general capturing the Pope. That's what we focus on. What may not be known is in that same identical year, this is a big year in archaeology, because in that year, Napoleon conquered in the Battle of the Pyramids the Islamic power there. It was a major battle. And that battle is noted by the archaeological community because it opened up, due to the conquest of the Islamic armies, the Bible lands to the west. And from that point on, you start seeing an influx of a lot of Westerners, particularly Christian Westerners, moving into the Holy Land, being able to do biblical archaeology, if you will, and opening up tremendous new insights into our biblical understanding. At the very time when historical criticism was starting to really undermine Europe and the United States' confidence, particularly Europe's confidence in the Bible. That will culminate in another year, 1840, which is interesting in the context of discussions and Revelation and the trumpets and Islam there that many of our pioneers thought about, because 1840 was after a certain treaty was made with the Ottoman Empire and the Western empires. It opened up even more so biblical archaeological opportunities. So those 2 years are actually known outside of Adventism in secular archaeological courses. That was the destruction of Islam to the extent that the West could start moving in and understanding the biblical world more accurately.
Thank you very much. It brings to my mind the fact that if you look at, say, the 1840s, God raises up an end-time Advent movement, but simultaneously you have the rise of Darwinism and Marxism and Mormonism. And you have these other ideologies are called into existence, calling for people's allegiance at the same time that God calls out a prophetic movement. We have a question here from Pastor Marcus Bates. He's joined us. He's an evangelist, written some books on the topic. So, Pastor Bates, please share your question with us.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Okay. Yes, this question is for our scholarly panel, and it's in reference to Dr. Gane's mention of William Miller's rule of taking a symbol literally when it makes sense to do so. And this is a question that I've wrestled with, and I'm wondering if our scholars could provide us with some guidance on how to apply that principle, because I've noticed that there are some symbols in prophecy that would make perfect sense being taken literally, and yet are understood typologically. And one example comes to mind, Amos 9, 11, and 12, and cross-reference with Acts 15, 13 through 17. You know, that text in Amos could potentially make perfect sense literally, but yet the Apostle James applies it in a typological sense. And I also am aware of another example in Revelation 11:2 when it talks about trampling the holy city for 42 months. Potentially that could make sense literally, but yet when you look at how Ellen White understood that, she took the holy city to mean the church and the 42 months to be the 1260 years. And so, and this brings into question the day-year pattern too. And so I guess I'm looking for some guidance on how to wrestle with that rule from William Miller, when clearly there are examples where verses can be taken either way and make sense both ways.
Will members of our panel like to respond to that? Of Dr. Li?
Is that on? Yeah, let me just say something quick. It may not answer your question, but I think sometimes we do the opposite of what William Miller would have liked us to do. Because ultimately, the Bible is our text, our textbook, or call it what you will. The Bible is the Word of God. And the Bible should tell us how to interpret it. And sometimes we have the idea that we have to follow William Miller's method of interpretation. But that's not what he would have told us to do.
It didn't get him particularly far either. It didn't get him very far either. Yes, Dr. Gane, do you have a thought on that?
Well, for one thing, Revelation 11:1, we need to look at context there too. Like, I was given a measuring rod like a staff. And this, of course, is within the context of Revelation in an apocalyptic context. And he's given this measuring rod in that context and is told, rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there, but don't measure the court. Now, this doesn't really make very good sense in the normal everyday life to do this. Not only that, it's related to Ezekiel chapter 40 and following, where there was the measuring rod of the angel to measure the temple. And the idea is to show that something is real, or it's going to be real. So there are contextual reasons to take that as symbolic. And then trampling the holy city for 42 months. And then my two witnesses will prophesy for 1260 days, clothed in sackcloth. These are the two olive trees and the two lampstands. The whole context of this discussion here is clearly symbolic. But when you come to Daniel 11, at the end, as I showed from the beginning of the chapter, we all agree that it's literal at the beginning, and then nobody has managed to show convincingly a reason or a point where it switches its literary genre. Now, people can say, well, theologically, there's a difference when Christ came, and of course, the covenant promises go to the Christian people of the worldwide Church of God, and I mean that in the sense of not the technical sense, and I agree with Laurendale on that. But the end of Daniel 11 isn't talking about promises; it's not talking about that subject, And furthermore, there's no genre indication that it's anything other than this little interpretation. So it's a case-by-case basis. You have to take it on a case-by-case basis and look for the clues in the text itself. Yeah. Now, and Tarsee is right too. Just because William Miller said something about hermeneutics, we don't have to accept it. Just like, for example, the fact that our biblical canon was established by who? A bunch of Pharisees. Do we accept the authority of the Pharisees? Since when? No, but we accept their criteria and the reasons why they made those choices. This is why we accept the Protestant canon. And so it's William Miller's, he said that, and we agree with him on that because it's right interbiblically. There's evidence for that within the Bible, comparing Scripture with Scripture. All Scripture is inspired, but rightly dividing the word of truth. It fits with that, fits with what Ellen White says, and our church has adopted that as a hermeneutic, which, as the people of the book, we agree with that.
All right, I think that's very helpful, just with the understanding that these rules by William Miller are not hard and fast guidelines. They are more like general principles, and you need to assess the context of the passage you're looking at before deciding how to apply those rules.
Yeah, there's one more point I'd like to make on the bet in Daniel 11, verse 40 that we've been discussing so much. Be'et kates, this preposition. You know, prepositions are so crucial in the Hebrew Bible. And, I believe in propositional truth and prepositional truth. But here, the bet can mean either in or during. But I'll make this point as we were discussing at lunch, and I made the point, Conrad, that when you're looking at something, you can look at the same thing either punctiliarly, as with the aorist tense in Greek, or you can look at it linearly, and it depends on your perspective. For example, if you're in eastern Colorado, you're driving on Highway 80, you see the mountains way off in the distance, they look like a point, right? And you keep driving, and you get into the mountains, and you're in the duration of the mountains. It's a lot more. So it's just a matter of perspective. So when you're looking ahead at the time of the end, it's way over there. See, that's the time of the end. But you get into it, and it has a duration. Yes, of course it has a beginning, but it keeps going.
All right, thank you very much. Pastor Nelson?
I don't know if we can switch gears for a little minute away from some of the topic, but I did have a question I wanted to ask the panel, and maybe Roy and the Islamic representatives a little bit, just trying to understand. So Daniel 11:21, in his estate shall arise a vile person, the New King James says. Is this the phrase that I hear you guys talking about, despicable person? Is this the...
That's right. It's a nifal of baza, which means despised.
Okay.
And the nifal is one who is despised. That is participle, I should say. Yeah.
Clarify for me how you identify this individual. Who is this individual? That's my question.
All right, Dr. Carlos?
When we read chapter 11 and this text, we reach to this text, is a very important text. First, because it's when you prepare the different paragraphs, this is our starting point in the chapter. It's a how can I express? It's a a point where there is the transition that Dr. Lee was asking this morning. Why? Because here we have some elements that are very singular. First, the name that is given to this vial, the word person is not in the original. This contemptible, as Doctor said, is despised. It's someone that is using the same word that is applied to Jesus in Isaiah 53. So he is someone who, in some way, who pretends to be like God, who is taking his position. And the other elements that I have found here is, when I work with the whole chapter, I found that there is 4 main verses that are repeated many times here. Strengthened, that is Hazak, Amat, to stand, Bo, to enter, and the other one I cannot recall in this moment, but 3 of them as applied to this contemptible person. And it's very interesting that when he's talking about him later, in verse 22, there is another expression applied to him that and is weasa, and that is also used for other powers in chapter 11. It's about weasa, and he did. And yes, literally, and he did. Some verses, translations put, he do as he pleases. And this is applied to the mighty king in 11:4. It's applied to Rome in 11:16, and now it's applied here to this power specifically. It's interesting that later it is applied also in 11:32 to God's people who is being persecuted. And when I found these elements, some of these elements, I realized that this power is a singular power. And I understand that this power is the papacy, who is, from this starting point, we have this character working along the whole chapter. And this is I wanted to ask this question in the morning, but well, so other people asked that question to Dr. Li, because when you read there, who is, let's say, for example, verse 23, who is the he who make a covenant with whom? Then I have found that the main character from verse 21 on is this despicable, this contemptible character who is the one working there along the whole chapter. And well, I will check again the work of Pastor Li to see that he's the one, the main subject in this section.
So I do have a follow-up question to this. I just wanted to ask Dr. Gane. I hear you, Brother Morris, saying that this despicable one is the papacy. How does Dr. Gane view this?
I do not believe that it can be the papacy, because I believe that by intertextual, intratextual comparison with Daniel 9, verses 26 and 27, the Prince of the Covenant, also with verse 25, the Prince of the Covenant is Christ. All right? So if the Prince of the Covenant is Christ, and if we're moving along from one power to another chronologically, as I said later, it's topical within one, the other papacy. It could be topical within any of these. But if we're moving basically chronologically, then in verse 21, it could not be the papacy, because in verse 22, Christ is killed under imperial Rome. And furthermore, when it says a contemptible person, why is he contemptible? Now, Uriah Smith made a really big deal about how debauched and how cruel Tiberius was. That's not relevant, okay? Caligula, Nero were also. The thing that's relevant is here, why is he contemptible? Because he's a usurper, that's why. And that's what other scholars recognize. To whom royal majesty has not been given, he'll come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. He's a usurper. They try to make Antiochus Epiphanes a usurper, but he really wasn't. He was a son of Antiochus III when his brother Seleucus IV died, and so on. There's a story there. But he wasn't really a usurper. He was trying to keep the kingdom from Heliodorus, who was outside the dynastic line. But it has to be, in other words, likely Roman, because it's just before Christ dies, okay? So likely. It has to be a usurper. And so who could that be? Who could it be who obtains royal majesty? Well, in the Roman realm, they didn't have kings before the imperial reign. So if this is Roman, how could it be a usurper? What sense does that make? The only person that it really fits is Julius Caesar. He really did usurp the power of the Republican Rome, the power of the Senate. He was a usurper. That's why he got assassinated. And he was the one who then initiated, even though he died in the attempt, he initiated the reign of the emperors, because Octavian was his heir to his estate, and Octavian took over as the first emperor, and then Tiberius is the second. Tiberius was no usurper at all, and so on. So that's the reason I would say that it's Julius Caesar here, and if that's the case, then verse 20 could not be Augustus, or you would have the chronological order reversed. And furthermore, Augustus doesn't work in verse 20, because within a few days he shall be... No, Augustus reigned 40 years. And then when it says neither in anger nor in battle, this is indicating a very unusual kind of circumstances of death. Otherwise, it wouldn't have to say this. And what was really unusual and the one who went out for the glory of the kingdom for Rome to extend the exacting of tribute and everything like this, and then he was killed after a short time in Egypt. It was neither in anger nor in battle. The Egyptians, he thought, would protect him. They were his allies. But instead of that, they were afraid of Julius Caesar, wanting to keep him happy, and so they simply murdered Pompey, and it was neither in anger nor in battle. It was just a cold, calculated political decision. So it fits very perfectly chronologically and with all the details of the text with that. Yeah.
I thought I heard you saying yesterday, talking about the despicable person when talking about verses like 28 and onward.
I was, because the anaphoric reference continues from here, from 21. The anaphoric reference continues through verse 45, continues. So Julius Caesar obviously didn't live that long, but he did initiate that power, that kind of a dynastic succession that continues unbroken from imperial Rome through the papacy all the way to the end, to verse 45.
Okay, so that's what confused me, because it sounded like you were grabbing this title from verse 21. It sounded to me like you had pegged verse 22 as a crucifixion of Christ, and yet you were using this title from a time before Christ to apply to the papacy, which was definitely confusing me, and that was what I was wanting to ask about.
Did that
right
clarify?
now.
What I just said, does that clarify?
It helps to see where you're coming from. It helps to see why you're using that frame, that title. I know that there are some, as I think Brother Mora was saying, that see the entry of the papacy in verse 21, and I would ask those, then what do you do with the breaking of the Prince of the Covenant in verse 22? I see it as a chronological impossibility, for the same reasons that you do, and I was just trying to get some clarification on that. Thank you.
So who do you think that the despicable person is?
So let me share a couple of items on that. I do believe in verse 20 that it is Augustus Caesar, and you do mention that he is broken after a few days. The question I would have is that it talks about a period in time of when he apparently is sending an oppressor through the glory of the kingdom. Well, we know that was around the time of the birth of Christ. His reign only lasted 10 more years after that. So within a few days, he was destroyed, not in anger and in battle. And supposedly, there's a lot of rumors among the Roman historians, but one of them makes the claim that his wife Livia, who had been intent on having Tiberius succeed him, he was so careful. One of these historians, I don't remember if it was Tacitus or who it was, but makes the claim that Livia painted poison on the fig tree out in his garden because he would not grab figs or any other fruit out of a basket for fear of being poisoned. So she painted, whether this is true or not, I don't know. It's just recorded in one of the historians that she painted poison on the figs on the tree, and that, they say that that's how he passed. And if that is the case, the following verse, verse 21, there shall arise a vile person, which you read The Lives of the 12 Caesars by Suetonius, and you read, I couldn't read the whole description of Tiberius. I said, I don't need this trash in my head, and stopped reading it. But he arises in his place, and it says, to whom they shall not give the honor of royalty. It's very interesting that the titles that the Caesars received at that time, Augustus had received the title Pater Patriae, which means the father of the fatherland, which modern Roman historians say conveyed a palpable monarchy with that title. And Tiberius never received that title. Many of the people after his reign received it, but he was skipped over. Augustus received it, he did not, and many of the Caesars that followed received it, but he did not receive that title, which conveyed palpable monarchy, and that he entered the kingdom by the intrigues, not the intrigues of himself, but the intrigues of his mother, because the Roman historians claim that Livia was a curse to the Caesars, and that they impute her in the accidental death or somehow of the 3 people that Augustus had lined up to accept the kingdom in his place. And I wish I could find, I've read in Uriah Smith's book that he purportedly said when Livia asked him, "Let my son take your place," that he said, "Your son is too vile to wear the purple of Rome." I've never found if anybody's ever found a historical reference for that, I would be interested, but I've never found it. So that's how I see verses 20 and 21.
Okay, can we just move to Dr. Young? We have a bunch of people queuing up here with questions, so Dr. Michael, and then we have Dr. Daniel, and then we'll come to Dr. Carlos here. Okay.
I wanted to follow up with this question because it is an important one and an interesting one. I agree with everything Dr. Gane has said as well. But some additional context is important when trying to understand the passage as a whole, and that is the fact that this despised one is a specified, person. In other words, this becomes the running character. This character is never named again. It just becomes a he afterwards, whether it assumes the title of King of the North or not. So it seems to have an enduring nature. This despised one has an enduring nature, so it can't just apply to one person. It seems to apply to something more enduring than just one person because it continues. So I agree with Dr. Gane that Julius Caesar probably best fits, and that's for a simple reason that he, of course, usurped basically a royalty-type position. He becomes an emperor, and at the same time, some things go with that are important and virtually enduring for a very long time, and that is the fact that Caesar was deified. He was turned into a god, and then Augustus was actually named with the very same Greek words that we refer to Christ in the New Testament. He is the Son of God. And so you have this now emperor worship cult. Of course, the Pontifex Maximus title also comes in right with Julius Caesar. He attains that title, and then Augustus inherits it. And this essentially is continued until Constantine. And Constantine, of course, is actually called by the bishops of the time a Messiah. He is called the Christ. He is the Christ Savior. He was called the Savior, the Messiah, etc., lavished with messianic titles. And so these titles, after Constantine, however, are ceded generally to the bishops of Rome, who then take the Pontifex Maximus title, etc., etc. They are now worshipped. And so there's a continuity of themes and ideas that are all despicable. Being deified, being the high priest, at once, being worshipped, etc. So all of these things continue in a continuous stream from the emperor, the inauguration of the imperial role, through the papacy.
Yeah, just to comment on that, Julius Caesar was never an emperor per se. The Senate gave him the title of dictator. A dictator is one who speaks from the Latin verb dicere, and previously they'd given it to Sulla when they'd brought in Sulla to reform the armies of Rome, and he'd taken that title. But Julius Caesar was given the title of dictator, which essentially sets aside the normal senatorial process, and you now have what we now call dictatorial power, like power of emergency. But we have a question from Dr. Daniel Olari, then we'll come to Dr. Carlos. All right, okay, so Dr. Daniel, if you can stand by for one more speaker here, Dr. Carlos will want to respond to this.
Yes, in few words, I know that Price, the Prince of the Covenant, in verse 22, is maybe the big issue for many people there. I was glad to hear Pastor Yoder telling me about that he believes that it's Jesus, but it's Jesus during the papacy, and he proposes spiritual application, the attack that Jesus, not the crucifixion, but the attack that Jesus received in that moment. My question is, and I talked this with my friend Frank Hardy before, that the Prince of the Covenant is not Jesus. Why? Well, because prince is nagib, and it's the same word that is used in 926 to refers to Rome. And second, what covenant? In 30:31, when it's talking about God's covenant, it refers to holy covenant, but this is only called covenant. What covenant? In verse 23, the alliance between the despicable person and the Rome, the pagan Rome. What I have found here is that we have the development of the church-state union. And this is my proposal in development here, from small growing all until verse 27, especially verse 25, when talk that they sit together, and we can see this kind of fight during the Middle Ages between these two powers.
Yes, in 2019 we spent today discussing these so-called anchor texts, and one of them was this verse here. Brother Engel Yoda had a very, very different understanding of it back then, and I'm not sure you've changed your opinion since then, Brother Engel. But if this contemptible person runs throughout much of the rest of the chapter, because the prepositions don't change or the pronouns, that may, if hypothetically this is the papacy, well, Daniel 10, 11, and 12 is part of the explanation of Daniel 8, of the vision of Daniel 8. And in Daniel 8, the papacy, it grew as high as the host of heaven. It threw down to the earth some of the hosts and some of the stars and trampled on them, even against the prince of the host, it acted arrogantly. Well, if hypothetically, I mean, you may argue this is a union of church and state, but if this contemptible person is to be understood as the papacy, might it well be that this prince of the covenant is indeed Jesus, but this is them obscuring his heavenly high priestly ministry, that they are actually acting against his role while in the plan of salvation during the Middle Ages here. And so it's not necessarily the crucifixion of Jesus, but the papacy acting to obscure his role in the plan of salvation. It's just a thought to think about. We have Dr. Daniel with a question for us here, having thrown out that grenade. But Dr. Daniel, you have some comments or a question?
Yeah, thank you very much. I follow the discussions and the answers, questions, and I also believe that in 21, 22, there is a transition point, and it's a connection, intertextual connection with Daniel 9, the prophecy there. My question I want to is related to the way we do exegesis, because if it is what I understood, there are several positions, and for me it was good to know faces attached to each of those positions, and it's my pleasure to know all of you and those that support one of these positions. And because all of us, we believe that we are exegetes first, I mean, we deal with the text. I want to ask you, I mean, all of you, I mean, regardless of the interpretation that you stand for, how do you find your exegetical motivation, for instance, while you are in verse 16 or 17, and when you read Hebrew, it's continuous, the flow of the text is going smoothly forward, or you got to verse 20, 21, 22, 23, where we just heard that there we have only personal pronouns that connects or takes the subject again in a continuous way. How do you find yourself as exegetes? You find this is to switch between the historical realities from one verse to another, and not try to keep it as much as you can as exegetes, the same subject, the same character, for a longer paragraph, not so easily changing the fulfillment. I mean, this is, I perceive that as being a question that has to do with the way we practice exegesis, because otherwise we are compelled to add, like, as a historicist, we have like an assumption here that we can switch from here to there to other characters, but that's not so much our task as exegesis, where consistency obliges us to keep the same character. And now I want to introduce, let's say, in conversation, what you know about another interpretation that is not considered in this forum, is Professor Ducan's. What he tried, if I understood correctly, what he tried to do is he noticed this interchange between characters as in chapter 11, and he tried to simplify the problem, and he went in his way. I mean, there are some methodological issues there, but he tried to keep the same character throughout, or at least to the symbol to attach to one single entity. How do you find as exegetes this? Do you find it as an issue, or what is your response?
Okay, can we ask Dr. Hardy, you have your hand raised here. Can you give us a first response here, please?
Just to clarify, I love Dr. Carlos and the Lord. We're good friends, but I don't share his views. If someone were to summarize my position, I think it would be Dr. Nelson. What he was just sharing, I could agree with that, but I definitely place Christ in verse 22 at the center of the chapter.
Mm-hmm. And that goes back to your paper last year, Dr. Hardy, where you showed Christ in chapter 10, chapter 12, and chapter 11. He brackets this prophecy, and he's at the heart of it. So thank you for that. Question for our experts here. Dr. Michael, you're a historian, and you spend a lot of time burrowing down into a certain aspect of history. It must get very easy to become emotionally attached to your discoveries than to try and want to apply it to the text.
That's a question.
It's not an accusation. It's an open-ended question for you to...
Sure.
Yes.
Well, there are many cases where history can help provide possibilities that we can explore more fully. One of the things, of course, that we today in our generation can't ignore is that we're inheriting a lot. It's impossible to ignore that. As historians, of course, as exegetes as well, there are a lot of traditions. One of the things I think that's most important then as a historian, and that's why it's actually been more the focus of what I have presented both in the past as well as this year, is to actually try and dialogue or engage in direct dialogue and learn from what the linguists are actually learning. And that's why I have greatly appreciated what Dr. Li has presented. Of course, I've been in dialogue. I've learned, and I've mentioned it before, I've appreciated what Dr. Nunez and Dr. Hardy have offered, and in many cases I have been able to see how what they have offered in the sense of critiquing mainstream translations, mainstream interpretations of the text can be very helpful to zero in on things. Speaking as a historian, though, again, most of it, we don't work only in our Adventist vacuum, but we work within a broader context, and there is a fairly broad interpretation by critical scholars. Now we have the weight of lots of people, not lots of minds, and so you're not just working with your mind and your pet theories, but you're engaging in a big circle. And you are working with certain bodies of literature, and for the first 19 verses, I mean, there is wide agreement. It's fascinating to read it when I look at it and see people that I think it was Tom Davies or Ben Skolnick, one of them, was writing about this, and he was saying this is the most accurate history. He doesn't believe it's prophecy, but he says this is the most accurate history we can find because it correctly synthesizes all the other disparate information we have. And so historians are extremely impressed by what you have in the beginning from verses 5 to 19. So much so that they believe it was written after the fact. That's how impressive it is to historians, dating back to hundreds of years and hundreds of scholars. So you're starting from something. You're starting from something. The question then we have, and that's why I'm interested in it, is to try and continue to dig into that and see if even from previous portions, things that have supposedly been fulfilled, we can affirm them, reaffirm them, and or critique them and tweak them, see if there's ways that we can find more evidence to support certain claims. That's the case when we look at some of the early verses. I know that some of the history, for example, has been challenged in Daniel 11:9. A lot of people don't believe that there's any historical evidence for that. It's true, for example, that we don't have good archaeological evidence. We don't have any original evidence from the time, although we do have later historians who do affirm it, meaning ancient historians. We have ancient historians from the early centuries who do affirm it without being referring to Daniel. But we have a gap there. Trying to identify those things and work through the process painfully and slowly is the best way to proceed. When you get to the level of trying to put it all together, you are going to look for textual patterns and see if you can find, how many transitions occur in Daniel 11. Do the number of transitions correlate with what we see earlier? Do we see, as I shared in my presentation earlier, do we see lexical comparisons? Those are immediate clues that can help us, that are right on the surface, that can help us begin to dig into and try and place things within a framework. As I just mentioned, the despised one, this is an enduring narrative character, so perhaps it isn't just a singular character. And then, of course, I know for those who have been paying attention to what I have focused on especially, you're going to find certain key words that have not been explored. Mm-hmm. And I have placed much emphasis on the ketum, because if you actually go to the lexicons and dictionaries that are popular, I'm convinced that they're in error, because they accept Josephus at face value, that it has an expanded meaning, Cyprus, but more than Cyprus. But he is referring to a very late time, after which point many commentators have already begun to discuss it. And so then we're actually going to have to critique it and realize, well, if Daniel was actually written earlier than critical scholarship claims, then perhaps the meaning of the word also needs to be modified. So that means the lexicons that we have and much of the commentary we have will need to be corrected. And I'm happy to share in the sense of, as has been acknowledged, much rests on this. If ketum is interpreted correctly or incorrectly, then entire interpretations will fail or be affirmed. So, all of that is working to try and understand the context of words, how they've been used, how they've been understood by exegetes, how they've been understood by historians, and put it all together into one package. And it is very much a team effort. I have tried to work hard as somewhat of a historian working with exegetes, elbow to elbow, trying to do the best that I can to synthesize the information, but it has very much been a group process, and I have learned from everyone as I try and dig into the history.
Oh, thank you. And Dr. Gane, you've actually published a monograph on Daniel 11. You've published a journal article on this.
Well, yes, I published in Journal of the Adventist Theological Society.
So my question is, once you've published, it's kind of like, is it then set in stone?
No.
Or how does it evolve on from there?
No, not at all. Like my mentor and teacher, Jacob Milgram, he was happy to contradict himself in print and say, I've changed my mind. And he would say that in private, and he was proud of it, willingness to change my mind. If I change my mind, I'll publish it. Say I was wrong for this and this is the reason. Because what we're interested in, the whole purpose of publishing and research is to help promote the development of our search for truth. And if that means that we went down a wrong alley, we need to let other people know, hey, I went down a wrong alley. That's the only responsible thing to do. Can I just make a comment briefly on 1122? And I do agree with Frank Hardy on that. I think he did good work on that. The Nagid, there are two Nagids in Daniel 9, 25 and 27. There's Mashiach Nagid, who we all accept as Christ. And then there's Nagid Haba, who destroys the city and the sanctuary that a lot of us regard as Titus and the Roman armies. It is the Mashiach Nagid who is the one who, in verse 27, confirms a covenant. And so there you have the connection between the Brit covenant and the Nagid. So the Nagid HaBrit is Christ who confirms the covenant with many. And there's a lot of evidence here. We could go into all of that. Within the midst of the week, he makes this sacrifice and offering cease and all the rest of it. So if that's the case, coming to 1122, that really needs to be Christ. Now, it's true that in 1123 there is an alliance. Sometimes that's translated covenant. It has nothing to do with the word brit. It's the word hit habrut, which is an infinitive construct of a totally different root, haver. So that has nothing to do with Nagid Brit, the Prince of the Covenant. And in fact, the word Brit in Daniel is used uniformly of the covenant with God, the good covenant. Daniel 9, when he's praying, and then also later on in this chapter, against the despicable one that is the papacy is against the holy covenant, and so on and so forth. So, but then the implication of that is significant. This means that Christ is at the center of this chapter, okay? And that's a very nice thing, and Frank Hardy has emphasized that. It also means that from then on, according to Laurendale's methodology, if he were correct, that everything after that should be translated symbolically, which I don't agree with, but this is his idea. He says after Christ, things have to be symbolic. Then it should be from verses 23 on. But he doesn't start with this symbolic language there. He puts it at 31. All right, so that's inconsistent. And then what do you do with all the military language in 25 and following? It's just too specific. If you try to make symbols out of every one of those things, it's going to be ridiculously complex. Clearly, it's continues to be literal, and it's after Christ has come. Now, if that's the case, then what case can be made for a valid point at which you flip into being symbolic? If it's not the death of Christ, which it's supposed to be, then what is it? And my answer, of course, is it's not.
Okay, so if I can just, oh yes, Pastor Nelson, I've got a question for Dr. Li then.
Yeah, I just want to respond to Roy's comments. In my 2018 paper, I've taken verses 23 through 28 and made them symbolic and showed how they connect with the history of the church. If that's a question you're really seeking an answer for, you can look at it there.
That's your 2018 paper? Or 2019?
What was the first year we had it?
2018. It was the 2018. That was when we were talking about the typological hermeneutical key for the chapter. Yes. All right, Dr. Tarsee, we've heard mentioned just a couple of times that this contemptible person, he rises in verse 21, but I've heard Dr. Carlos said he kind of runs through the chapter. On the one hand, we hear that it may be Julius Caesar, it may well be, but in what sense does he run through the chapter?
Well, of course, Julius Caesar did not live that many centuries.
Yes.
So the figure of this king is being applied not only to whoever that was, whether it was Julius Caesar or someone else, but to all the other references to that entity. So just in the same way as if we apply to the papacy, we're not saying this is only the first pope.
Yes.
We'd say it's all the popes, for example, okay? And so that's how you'd have to see it. That's how you see the entire chapter.
So you're saying that the personal pronouns that run through the he all the way through refer back to this contemptible person?
I would say yes. Yes. Now, of course, that brings us into an issue of interpretation, okay? And if verse 22 is indeed an anchor point referring to the death of Christ, okay, which, I have no problem with. I think it's likely. I don't have a better explanation for that. So, therefore, you'd have to include both pagan and papal Rome in that figure of the king of the north, contemptible person, and so on. And I actually like that because it seems that as you move through Daniel, the lines of distinction become more and more blurred for the last few beasts, if you want to call it that. You have 4 metals in chapter 2, you have 4 beasts in chapter 7, and yet when you look at the 4 beasts, the 4th beast has, if I remember correctly, yes, it has both iron and bronze, okay? So it has teeth of iron and claws of bronze. Well, those are 2 different metals in chapter 2, right? When you come to chapter 8, of course, you wouldn't have the first beast, but you do have 2 animals. And now, all of a sudden, you no longer have a beast with 10 horns from which a little horn comes out. You only have the little horn. And now the little horn seems to include whatever the beast of chapter 7 meant, along with whatever the little horn of chapter 7 meant. Yeah? And so it seems to fit that pattern that when you come to chapter 11, then there's a blending of these, which also helps us to see the blending between the Seleucids and the Roman powers, which to me also takes me back to chapter 8, and I would say that's one more reason why I don't have a problem with the little horn growing out of one of the horns of Greece either, because as you move along, Greece and Rome become less and less and less distinguished.
All right, so what I hear you saying is for instance, in 2 Thessalonians 2, the man of sin, the spirit of lawlessness that is already at work. Clearly, behind the individuals involved, there is another power at work. And so are we saying potentially this contemptible person, he may have appeared as Julius Caesar in this verse, but there is a power hostile to God at work that runs and it matures through the pagan Rome and imperial Rome to papal Rome as we go through this chapter.
Yeah, yes.
Okay,
yes.
All right. Brother Engel, wait, Brother Engel, before you answer, we have Dr. Frank Hardy has a comment, then I'll come to you. Dr. Hardy?
Yes. Would it be possible for you to allow me to share my screen?
Yes. Guys on the audio-visual, can Dr. Hardy share his screen? Okay, he says you can. Yes, his thumbs are up.
Can. Okay, now, where's the command?
Go to the bottom of your screen, and
Yep.
you should see a little green button that says Share Screen. Just roll your mouse to the bottom.
Okay, all right. So that is good, and let me share this screen. Can you see it?
Yeah, could you increase the size?
Well, yeah, but one part of the thing that I'm trying to convey is the scope, the way this breaks apart. To Dr. Gaines' point, I think Laurendale was right, largely correct. He said verse 31, actually the spiritual terms start in verse 30. And we can document this. We can point to the terms that are involved. We don't have to guess. So in 11:14, you have the word hechazon, the vision. That's the only thing in the first third of the chapter that I could call spiritual. Then you have three terms in the next section. But notice, starting with 11:30, the Holy Covenant, the temple and fortress, the regular burnt offering, and it goes down to the bottom of the page to 12:3. So this is where the terms are actually found. Laurendale's observation was factually correct.
All right.
And what this shows is that after 22 does not necessarily mean after the cross. In my view, we're dealing with the recapitulation, 23 through 28. Go back over the Roman period. So it's two looks at one period, seeing one period from 2 points of view. Whether you accept that or not, it is the case that this is the distribution of spiritual terminology in Daniel 11.
Dr. Hardy, would it be possible for you to share that with us? We can post it on the conference website.
Okay, it is in my presentation, but I'll send this through to you as a separate page.
Okay, thank you so much. Much appreciated. Brother Engel Yoda?
All right, I have not changed my position from last year, and I do agree with Dr. Mora that the contemptible person there in verse 21 is the introduction of the papacy. And as I understand it, this is not two words, vile person. I don't think the word person is in the Hebrew, is it? It's just contemptible.
You're right, it's just contemptible one, whatever. Yeah.
Okay, so, and for whatever reason, the word person in my version is not in italics, but it certainly is implied there. But my main exegetical reason for this is in Malachi. The same word is used a number of times in the book of Malachi, and it's talking, God is taking the apostate priests to task for making the table of the Lord contemptible. Same word. He does that a couple of times in chapters 1 and 2. And then when you go to Malachi 2, beginning with verse 7, he's describing these apostate priests, which sounds a lot like the papacy in New Testament times. This is what he says: "For the lips of the priest should keep knowledge, and people should seek the law from his mouth, for he is a messenger of the Lord of hosts. But you have departed from the way. You have caused many to stumble at the law. You have corrupted the covenant of Levi, says the Lord of hosts." Now check verse 9. "But, therefore, I also have made you contemptible and base before all the people, because you have not kept my ways, but have shown partiality in the law. Now, we all know the apostasy that the little horn brought into the Christian church. It's called the Great Apostasy. And so when you follow the beginnings of this great apostasy, you get the Dark Ages. And that's what I see in verse 22. Now, I agree that the Prince of the Covenant is Christ. The question is, does this refer to the cross, or does it refer to the breaking of God's people, God's true people? They shall be swept away from before him and be broken. That's, in my view, the breaking of God's true people in the dark ages of the great apostasy when the church became corrupt. And then it also says, and also the Prince of the Covenant. Well, how were they broken in that period of history? They were brokenhearted over what was happening in the church. And I don't have it before me, but I think it's in Ezekiel where God weeps, the Lord weeps and is brokenhearted over the apostasy of his people. And it happened in Old Testament times with the Jewish apostasy, and has happened again in New Testament times. So I see that as the context. So if you're going to argue that it can't be the papacy in verse 21 because the cross comes in verse 22, I'm saying, well, this does follow the papacy in verse 21, Dark Ages, and the figurative breaking of God's people and Christ himself as being brokenhearted, not physically. So in that sense, verse 22 is the center. Prince of the Covenant is Christ, and it still remains in the center of the chapter. It just takes it to a different time. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Pastor Gerhard, were you raising your hand there a minute ago? Were you raising your hand for a minute? No. All right, okay. My apologies. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for that comment, Brother Engel. And coming back to Pastor Carlos, do you have any further comments on what? No? All right, okay. Dr. Tarsee, anything further you want to add on this particular issue?
I was just noticing, just adding to it, I think we can look at 22 in different ways, but I was noticing 31, that 31 definitely is applicable to the Middle Ages, because you have there the reference to removing the tamid and also the abomination that makes desolate. And so, where before 31 or after 31, not after, before 31, you could begin with the medieval powers, medieval papacy, but 22, it seems like it would have happened before the Middle Ages. That's all.
I would agree that it's before 538. The league, I think, in verse 23, is the league between church and state. So from the time that the papacy rose to power, actually, from the time of Constantine, that preceded the 1260 years by a couple hundred years.
Yeah, I think that may be another point of agreement. I agree that this is the league between church and state in the time of Constantine and so on, in verse 23. If that's what you're saying,
yes.
I agree with it. Yeah. I think Tim would agree with it as well, right? Yeah.
All right, so I think we're kind of coming to a natural conclusion. There was a couple of things we wanted to talk about, but they're way more than half an hour's discussion. So if it's okay with you folks, I'd like to say it's time to kind of draw this to a conclusion today. Would that be all right to our panel of scholars? To our long-suffering audience, we want to thank you for patiently in exhibiting the endurance of the saints as we've gone through today and from Wednesday night through to this afternoon. And so I would like to say thank you to all those people who have made presentations Yes, Dr. Carlos.
No, I just want to add that it's very good to be here, and really Daniel 11 is like a diamond. It has many faces, and as someone expressed before, we need different approaches, different specialities to focus on the book, and this specifically this section, and it's great to be here, and the spirit that I have found that it is open, kind, and that's the right way to do the research.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carlos, for those generous words. For those of you who've been joining us online, we want to thank you for your time, for your contributions. Tomorrow, we have a full day. We have Elder Stephen Bohr preaching for our first service, and Elder Christian Martin, who works with Pastor Finley over at Living Hope Center in Virginia, for our second service. Their focus is going to be on the role of prophecy in evangelism in particular, and in the personal spiritual life and the life of the individual, what significance it has, and also in the life of the Adventist Church. During the Sabbath School, we'll have a panel discussion with our evangelists, such as Pastor Rosenberg and Pastor Bohr and some others, discussing how they find prophecy in evangelism. What are the pros, what are the cons, what are the pitfalls to avoid, what are the strengths in our 21st century. And we'll be continuing that discussion tomorrow afternoon as well. So we look forward to have a full day of discussions tomorrow. We start at 8:30 in the morning for our first service. And so may God give us a restful entry to the Sabbath hours now. And maybe Dr. Gane, would you close for us in prayer? And then we can look forward to tomorrow.
Yeah. Father in heaven, we know what Daniel sacrificed and what he went through as a loyal person of God. And we can see in this text that we've been studying that we will be called to be loyal to you no matter what. And if we go through the time of trouble, the big time of trouble or a smaller time of trouble, we know that you're there, behind the shadows, watching over your own, as the hymn says. We thank you so much that you are the light shining in the darkness, that your wings are overspreading us, always keeping us like a hen has her chicks, as Jesus said. We thank you so much that we can gather here together with collegiality, with courtesy, and truly enjoying and learning from one another. Because if we all thought the same, it would be pretty boring. But we're coming at it from different perspectives, different angles, with different data. We're learning from each other, and it's exciting. We thank you so much. Now give us a good rest this Sabbath, and as we go into this evening and the Sabbath hours, and then tomorrow our discussion, we know that your Spirit will continue to be with us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.